had been looking forward to spending some quiet time alone for a while. Life in the city had become loud and full of stress, and I wanted a place where no one would bother me, where I could sit in silence, read, and maybe hike a little. I found a small cabin listed online, deep in the woods of a rural county. It wasn't fancy, but it had running water, a fireplace, and a view of the forest. The price was cheap, probably because it wasn't close to any town. The nearest store was over an hour away by car. That didn't matter to me. The more distance between me and other people, the better I thought it would be. I arrived in the early afternoon. The dirt road to the cabin was rough, narrow, and full of potholes. My car shook as I crawled along, the forest closing in around me. The trees grew so thick on both sides that they blocked out most of the sun. I felt isolated the moment I turned onto that road. By the time the cabin came into sight, I felt relief. It was small, single-story, with weathered wooden walls and a slanted roof that sagged a little in the middle. There was a stone chimney, a small porch with 2 steps, and one door with peeling green paint. The cabin had clearly stood there for many years, maybe decades, but it looked solid. I carried my bags inside. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and smoke. There were 2 small rooms, a main room with a fireplace, a table, and a bed pushed against the far wall, and a narrow side room that served as a kitchen. The windows were small, with latches instead of locks. The bathroom was an outhouse not far behind the cabin. I had known that from the listing. I figured I could deal with it for a week. At first, everything was calm. I unpacked my food supplies, some canned goods, bottled water, and simple groceries. I stacked firewood next to the fireplace, just in case the nights turned cold. I sat on the porch as the sun went down and listened to the forest. At first, it was peaceful, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But once the light faded, the woods changed. The sounds grew louder, sharper. Twigs snapping, branches swaying, something moving through the undergrowth. I told myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. The woods were full of them, and I wasn't worried. I had brought a flashlight and a pocket knife, though neither gave me much comfort. I went inside, shut the door, and lit a small lamp. The cabin creaked in the night as old wood does. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every noise outside. It took me a long time to fall asleep. The first 2 days passed quietly. I hiked a little on the trails behind the cabin. I cooked simple meals, read my book, and wrote notes in a small journal. During the day, the forest felt calm and open. Sunlight broke through the trees in narrow beams, birds sang, and I even spotted a couple of deer grazing near a stream. It felt safe, almost soothing. But at night, I began to notice things that unsettled me. The noises outside weren't just random. I could swear they circled the cabin, slow and steady, like footsteps. Sometimes there would be long stretches of silence. Then suddenly the crunch of leaves, close to the window. I would freeze listening. My heart would pound in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to peek outside with my flashlight, I never saw anything. Just trees, thick shadows, and empty ground. On the 3rd night, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. It was light, like fabric dragging or fingertips grazing the wood. Then it stopped. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. A few seconds later, I heard it again, this time on the other side of the cabin. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on, afraid of what I might see. I told myself it had to be branches moving in the wind, but when I listened closely, I realized the trees weren't close enough to touch the walls. Something else had been there. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but they weren't shaped like hooves or paws. They looked like shoe prints. They weren't very clear, but I could see the rough outline of a sole. The strange part was how close they came to the cabin walls, as if someone had been walking right next to the structure, circling it. That discovery unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a hunter or hiker had passed through, though I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived. The cabin was so far off the main road that no one should have been wandering near it by accident. Still, I forced myself to stay calm. I went about my day, chopping some wood, tidying the kitchen, and taking a short hike. But the track stayed in my mind. That night, the noises returned, only louder. It wasn't just footsteps or brushing anymore. It sounded like someone tugging at the door handle. I sat in the dark, holding the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, staring at the door. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. My mouth went dry. I didn't move for hours, waiting. When the sun finally rose, I felt drained, my body stiff from sitting upright all night. In the morning, I checked the door. The handle was scratched, faintly, as if metal had scraped against it. I couldn't tell if it had been like that before. My stomach tightened with unease. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving back to the city. But I kept convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had rattled the handle. Maybe I was overreacting. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and I didn't want to cut it short because of nerves. The following evening, I tried to relax by the fire. I sat with my book, forcing myself not to focus on every sound outside. But then I noticed something new. The window near the bed, which I was sure I had latched shut, stood slightly open. Just an inch, but enough to catch my attention. I hadn't touched it. I got up slowly, closed it, and slid the latch into place. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint movements outside, sometimes soft, sometimes heavier, as if someone was shifting their weight on the porch. Around midnight, I smelled smoke. My eyes snapped open, and I panicked, thinking the cabin was on fire. But when I checked the fireplace, the embers had died down hours earlier. The smell came from outside. I opened the door a crack and sniffed the air. Somewhere in the woods, not too far away, smoke drifted through the trees. It was faint, but distinct, like someone had lit a small fire. I couldn't see the glow, but I knew it was there. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone out here. By morning, the smoke smell was gone, and no sign of fire remained. But the ground near the cabin showed new footprints. Clearer this time, they were definitely human. The prints circled the cabin and stopped near the window I had found open. My stomach dropped when I realized what that meant. Someone had tried to get inside. I spent the whole day on edge. I kept checking the windows, the door, the trees around the cabin. My mind spun through possibilities. A local passing through? Someone camping nearby? Or someone deliberately watching me? I didn't know, but the thought of being targeted made every muscle in my body tense. That evening, I made a mistake. I left my lantern burning as I read in bed. The light must have made me visible from outside, a clear silhouette through the thin curtains. Around midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, deliberate and steady. I froze, then slowly reached for the lantern and blew it out. Darkness swallowed the room. My heart raced as I crouched by the bed, straining to hear. A moment later, I saw movement at the window. A shadow passed across the faint moonlight seeping through the curtain. Someone was standing there, watching. I stayed perfectly still, hardly breathing. The shadow lingered, then moved on. I heard soft steps circling the cabin again, slow, dragging, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in silence, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When daylight finally came, I went outside, my nerves raw. In the dirt near the porch were fresh prints, deeper than before, made by heavier steps. I looked at them closely. They were from boots, men's boots. At that point, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bags, stuffing clothes and food into my backpack as fast as I could. But when I went to start the car, my chest dropped. One of the tires was flat. I checked and found a deep cut in the rubber, not a simple puncture. Someone had slashed it. Panic rose in me like a flood. I was miles from town, no cell service, and no way to drive out. My only option was to hike down the road towards civilization, but the thought of leaving the cabin, knowing someone was out there watching, made me feel trapped. I decided to wait until daylight the next morning to start walking. It felt safer than stumbling through the woods in the dark. I spent the rest of the day inside, listening for sounds. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept checking the windows, but the trees outside revealed nothing. That I went to the cabin because I thought it would give me peace and quiet, a few days away from everything that was weighing me down. It was tucked deep into the trees, far from town, the kind of place where you had to drive miles down narrow dirt roads that twisted through the woods. The air was colder up there, sharper, and when I stepped out of my car that first evening, the silence was the first thing that hit me. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, even the faint ringing in my ears. I stood there with my bag in hand, looking at the cabin. The wood was dark, the roof steep, the porch sagging a little at the corner. It wasn't new or polished. It looked worn and used, but sturdy enough to last another 20 years. Inside it smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. The walls were paneled, the floor rough, the furniture simple and heavy. There was a small stove, a couch that sagged in the middle, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed in the back room. I put my bag down and walked through slowly, feeling the boards creak under my weight. The windows were old glass, a little wavy, and when I looked out through them, all I saw were trees in every direction, crowding close, their trunks dark and damp with evening. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the stove and sat in front of it, watching the flames. The wind came through the trees outside, and I could hear it scrape against the corners of the cabin. At some point I dozed off, my head resting back against the wall, and when I woke up the fire was nothing but red coals. I added a log and stood by the window for a while. The forest was black, so dark it felt like it pressed up against the glass. I thought I saw something move out there, just a shift of shadow, but it was gone as soon as I noticed it. I told myself it was only the trees swaying in the wind. The second day I went out exploring. There was a narrow trail that led down behind the cabin, half covered in leaves. I followed it for a while, carrying a bottle of water and keeping track of the way back. The woods felt heavy, the air damp, and after a while I noticed how little sound there was. No birds, no insects, only the occasional creak of trees shifting. It made me uneasy, so I turned back sooner than I planned. When I reached the cabin again, I felt relief, as if I had been holding my breath the whole time. That night I woke to a noise. It was faint, just a dull thump, like something brushing against the porch. I stayed in bed, listening, holding my breath. After a while it came again, a little louder, and then the sound of wood groaning as if someone had stepped on the porch boards. My mouth went dry. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Eventually it stopped. I heard nothing else for the rest of the night. In the morning I went out to look. The porch was empty. There were no tracks, only a scattering of pine needles and damp leaves. I told myself it must have been a branch falling, maybe an animal. I tried not to think about it. But that night the noise came again. This time it was clearer, the sound of slow, heavy steps across the porch, the faint rasp of wood under weight. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The steps went from one end of the porch to the other, then stopped near the door. I waited, staring through the dark. I thought I could hear breathing, but I wasn't sure if it was my own. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. The next morning I checked the door. It was still locked. The handle was cold in my hand. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was damp and sharp. Again, nothing. No tracks, no marks. The dirt in front of the porch was undisturbed. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down I knew I wasn't. I considered leaving. I thought about packing up my bag, getting in the car, and driving back to town. But I had come all the way out here to get away, and part of me felt stubborn. I didn't want to run over nothing, not when I couldn't prove anything had happened. I decided to stay one more night to see if it happened again. That evening I made sure the door was locked, checked the windows, and pulled the curtains closed. I sat by the stove trying to read, but I kept glancing toward the door. The firelight flickered, throwing shadows across the walls. Hours passed. I thought maybe nothing would happen. Then, sometime after midnight, the sound came again. Steps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze in my chair. The steps stopped just outside the door. This time, there was no mistaking it. I could hear breathing. Long, uneven breaths, close to the wood. My chest tightened. Whoever it was, they were standing just feet away from me, separated only by the thin wall of the cabin. The breathing went on for a while, then stopped. I sat in silence, waiting. Eventually, I gathered the courage to move. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. The porch was empty. The night was black, the trees swaying faintly. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark, but saw nothing. The following morning, I checked again. Still nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone. But I knew what I had heard. I couldn't convince myself otherwise. I didn't leave that day. I don't know why. Something about the strangeness of it held me there. I felt like if I left, I'd never know what it was. And that thought sat heavy on me. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, trying to keep busy. All day I felt watched, though I never saw anyone. That night was worse. I lay in bed, waiting, every muscle tense. When the sound came, I wasn't surprised. The steps, slow and steady, across the porch. The breathing again, rough and uneven. This time there was more. I heard the faint scrape of metal on wood, like something sharp dragging along the doorframe. My skin went cold. I sat up, clutching the blanket, hardly able to breathe. The sound dragged slowly down the door, paused, then scraped again. It went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. The next morning I looked. There were marks on the door, thin, shallow scratches, running down the wood in uneven lines. I touched them with my finger. They were real. My stomach turned. Someone had been out there, dragging something sharp across the door in the middle of the night. That was when I decided to leave. I packed my bag quickly, shoving everything inside, and went out to the car. The air was still, the woods silent. I got in and turned the key. The engine coughed, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I tried a third time, pumping the gas. The engine turned over weakly but wouldn't start. My hands shook as I sat there. The car was dead. I went back inside the cabin and sat on the couch. The reality of it sank in. I was stuck there. No phone signal, no working car, miles from anyone. Whoever was out there knew it. They had to know it. The rest of the day crawled by. I barely ate. I kept checking the windows, jumping at every creak. As the sun went down, my chest tightened. I knew what was coming. That night, the steps came again, heavier than before. The breathing was louder, closer. The scrape of metal returned, dragging slower, longer across the doorframe. Then came a new sound. The handle rattling, soft at first, then harder. My whole body went cold. Someone was trying to open the door. I held my breath, staring at the handle, watching it twitch. The lock held. After a long time, the rattling stopped. Silence stretched out. Then the steps moved away, fading into the night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the door until daylight came. In the morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my bag, put on my jacket, and started walking. The road was miles long, winding through the woods, but it was the only way. My heart pounded as I walked, every sound making me jump. The trees seemed endless, the silence crushing. I walked for hours. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, faint and slow, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. I kept going, pushing myself harder. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. By late afternoon, I reached the main road. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. Not long after, a truck came by. I waved it down and the driver stopped. I climbed in, shaking, and told him to take me into town. I never went back to the cabin. Later, when I thought about it, I knew what had happened. Someone had been out there watching me, circling the cabin at night, trying to scare me, maybe trying to get inside. Maybe they had tampered with my car. Maybe they had been waiting for me to panic, to leave, to make a mistake. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know how real it was. I heard their steps, their breathing, the scrape of metal on wood. I saw the marks with my own eyes. Even now, years later, the memory makes my skin crawl. Sometimes at night, I wake up and swear I can hear those same slow steps outside, moving across the porch, stopping at the door. And every time, I lie there in the dark, holding my breath, listening, waiting for them to go away. I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin deep in the woods. It was early autumn, and the air had that sharp chill in the mornings that made you want to stay wrapped up in a blanket. The cabin was old, not falling apart but not new either. It had a tin roof that clicked when the sun hit it and creaked when the temperature dropped at night. It sat about a mile off a narrow dirt road that twisted through tall pines and thick brush. You couldn't see the cabin from the road, and once I parked my truck behind it and cut the engine, the silence swallowed me up. I carried my bags inside. The place smelled faintly of wood smoke, old lumber, and a little bit of mildew, the kind that comes from years of damp weather. The floor was uneven in spots, and some boards groaned under my weight, but the cabin was sturdy enough. There was a small wood stove, a single bed against the far wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves with some chipped dishes and a few cans left behind by whoever used the place before me. I wasn't worried about luxury. I had brought my own food, water, and supplies. The idea was to get away, to be alone, and to spend time away from phones, cars, and people. The first day was calm. I chopped a little firewood to stack near the door, set up my things, and walked around the clearing. The cabin was surrounded by forest on all sides, but to the west there was a slope that went down toward a stream. I could hear the water faintly from the cabin if the wind shifted right. It made me feel less cut off. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of people. Just trees, endless trees, tall trunks with branches that swayed and whispered when the wind pushed through them. That night, the forest was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I lay on the bed listening to the stove ticking as the fire died down. My ears strained for any sound. An owl, a distant coyote, even a branch snapping. But there was almost nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, and once in a while a faint rustle outside, like leaves dragging across the ground. On the second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I took a long walk, starting out in the morning with a thermos of water and a couple of granola bars. The trail I followed wasn't marked, just faint deer paths and flattened grass leading between the trees. After about an hour, I noticed something odd. At first I thought it was just another tree, but then I saw it was a pole. A tall, weathered wooden pole with a bit of rusty metal at the top. It looked like an old utility pole, the kind used for power lines decades ago. But there were no wires, no signs of others, just this one pole standing alone. I walked around it, brushing away vines that had grown up its sides. It didn't make sense. Why would a single pole be standing so deep in the forest, miles from the road? I pushed on farther, uneasy now, but curious. After another half-mile, I found something else. An old shack, half collapsed, almost hidden by the trees. The roof had caved in on one side, and the wood was blackened in places like it had been scorched long ago. I peered inside through a gap where the door used to be. There wasn't much left, just broken boards, rusted cans, and what looked like the frame of an old bed. The ground around it was littered with glass shards, some still green like they had been bottles once. I felt a wave of unease. This place had been abandoned a long time ago, but standing there alone, with the silence pressing on me, I felt like I was trespassing somewhere I shouldn't be. I turned back sooner than I planned. My pace was faster, my eyes flicking between the trees. Every time I thought I heard something, a snap, a shift of branches, I stopped and listened, but there was nothing. When I finally saw the cabin clearing again, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I had made it back to safety. That night, I sat by the stove longer than usual, feeding it logs just to keep the warmth and the sound going. I couldn't shake the thought of the pole and the ruined shack. The forest didn't feel empty anymore, felt watched. When I finally went to bed, I kept the lantern close by. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was pitch black except for the faint glow of coals in the stove. I lay there perfectly still because I thought I heard footsteps outside. Slow, dragging footsteps circling the cabin. My heart thudded in my chest. I strained my ears, but then it stopped. The silence was heavier than before. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but it hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded deliberate, careful. Morning made me feel foolish, but the unease stayed. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for tracks. The ground was covered in pine needles and damp leaves, so if there had been any prints, they were hard to see. Still, in one patch of softer earth, I noticed an indentation. Could have been a boot print, but it was smudged and faint. I stared at it for a long time, not sure if my eyes were making it up. The days that followed blurred together. I kept busy collecting wood, cooking, cleaning. But at night, I couldn't relax. The sounds outside grew more frequent. Sometimes it was footsteps, sometimes just the snap of a branch far too close to the cabin. Once I woke to the sound of something brushing against the wall, slow and steady, like fingers trailing across the boards. I sat up with my lantern, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. It did, eventually, but sleep never came back that night. By the fifth night, I was exhausted. My nerves were raw, my eyes heavy, but I couldn't let myself drift off. Every noise jolted me awake. Around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they came right up to the door. The wood creaked as weight shifted against it. I froze, staring at the door, certain the latch would rattle. But nothing happened, just silence. Then, faintly, the sound of retreating steps, moving back into the forest. At dawn, I made my decision. I packed up my things quickly, shoving them into my bags. My hands shook as I locked the cabin. Not that a lock would stop anyone determined enough. I loaded the truck and turned onto the dirt road. Every bump and jolt felt like it was pulling me farther away from something unseen. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. I never found out who or what was in those woods with me. Maybe it was someone living out there, hiding from the world. Maybe it was someone who had once lived in that ruined shack, still moving through the forest. Or maybe it was just the weight of being alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. But I know what I heard, and I know the feeling that kept me awake night after night. The silence of the forest wasn't empty. It was filled with someone else's presence. And I will never go back to that cabin again. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, and I had planned everything carefully. I wanted quiet, space away from work, no noise, no traffic, just a stretch of trees, the sound of the wind, and maybe the crack of branches under deer moving in the brush. I brought a cooler of food, a backpack with clothes, a box of firewood I had picked up on the way, and enough supplies to stay out there for a full week without needing to leave. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It sat on a small clearing with weeds creeping up the sides, and the boards on the porch showed their age with cracks running through the grain. Inside, it was simple. One big room with a bed against the wall, a small kitchen area with a gas stove, a wood stove for heat, and a table with 2 chairs. There was no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. I had to use a hand pump outside to fill buckets. That was part of what I liked about it, the feeling of being cut off and forced to rely on myself. The first night was calm. I unpacked, set my things on the shelves, and got a fire going in the wood stove. The air turned cool as the sun went down, and by the time it was dark, I could hear nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I slept well, almost better than I ever did back home. The next day, I kept busy. I gathered kindling, split some of the firewood I brought, checked the path that led out to the dirt road. The path was narrow and overgrown in parts, but clear enough that I wouldn't get lost. I went back and made some food, read a little from a book I had brought, and spent the afternoon just walking in the woods near the cabin. Everything seemed normal, almost perfect, but that night was different. I woke up around 2 in the morning. I didn't know why at first. It was pitch black inside the cabin. I could hear the faint ticking of the stove as the fire died down, but outside, something was off. I sat up in bed and listened. It was faint, but I could swear I heard the crunch of leaves, slow steps moving across the clearing. Not an animal. At least it didn't sound like one. The steps were too steady, too spaced out, like someone walking on purpose. I sat frozen, my ears straining. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time closer to the cabin. I felt my throat go dry. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The cabin wasn't on a trail, and the nearest house was miles away. I reached slowly for the flashlight I kept on the table beside the bed, but I didn't turn it on. I just sat there holding it, waiting, heart pounding so hard it hurt. After a while, the steps faded. I heard nothing but the normal night sounds again. I stayed awake for hours, listening, afraid to even move. When morning finally came, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, at least none I could see. I told myself it must have been a deer or maybe a coyote nosing around, though deep down I didn't believe it. That day I felt uneasy. I tried to keep busy, chopping more wood, carrying water, cleaning up inside, but I kept glancing at the tree line. The woods felt different now, like something was out there, watching. When night came, I kept the lantern burning longer than usual. I shut the door tight, slid the wooden bar across it, and stacked a couple of chairs against it just in case. I lay down but couldn't sleep. Hours dragged on, and every sound made me jump. At some point, I heard it again. The same slow steps outside, circling the cabin this time. They moved from one side to the other, sometimes stopping, sometimes starting again. I held my breath and didn't move. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but no animal paced in circles like that. I thought about calling out, but then I remembered I had no phone service. Even if I shouted, no one would hear me. The sound went on for what felt like forever. Then it stopped again, and the woods went still. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Just behind the cabin, in the dirt near the pump, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet, larger than mine, pressed deep into the mud. They were fresh, made sometime in the night. My hands shook as I bent down to look at them. Whoever it was had been standing right behind the cabin, just a few feet from where I slept. That day, I debated leaving. I thought about packing everything and heading back down the trail to my truck, but part of me didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I told myself maybe someone was just passing through, some hunter or drifter who had cut across the woods and stumbled near my cabin by chance. Maybe they would move on, but deep down, I knew better. I forced myself to stay one more night. I didn't know why, maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, but that night was worse than all the others. I set a fire in the stove and sat up with the lantern burning. I didn't even try to sleep. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. They came from the woods and moved slowly toward the clearing. I gripped the flashlight in one hand and the hatchet I used for chopping wood in the other. The steps stopped outside the door. I could hear the faint crunch of weight shifting, like someone standing there, listening. My skin crawled. Then I heard the soft scrape of fingers dragging across the wall of the cabin, moving along the boards, slow and deliberate. They circled the whole cabin like that, a hand sliding over the wood, testing it. I sat there frozen until the sound finally drifted back into the woods. To first light, I packed my things. I stuffed everything into my backpack, grabbed the cooler, and left the cabin as fast as I could. The trail felt endless, and every step I expected to hear footsteps behind me. When I finally reached my truck and locked the doors, I sat there shaking, drenched in sweat. On the drive back, I thought about those footprints, about the sound of that hand moving across the cabin wall. Whoever it was never tried to break in. They just circled, watching, waiting. Maybe they were testing me. Maybe they were waiting for me to open the door. Or maybe they just enjoyed terrifying me. I never went back to that cabin again. Weeks later, I thought about calling someone, maybe the sheriff in that county, but what would I even say? That someone walked around my cabin at night and never spoke, never showed themselves, just left footprints? They would dismiss it. They would say it was nothing. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have walked out of those woods at all. I went up to the cabin alone at the start of September. It was the same place I had visited every few years, a small wooden cabin that sat at the edge of thick woods, not far from a wide, still lake. The place belonged to a friend of my family, and they let me use it whenever I wanted time away. It had no internet, no cell service, and only a small radio that worked half the time. There was a generator out back for electricity, but I only used it sparingly because it made a lot of noise and used up fuel quickly. Most of the time, I lived off the small fireplace for heat and the lanterns for light. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built from heavy logs with a tin roof that rattled when the wind blew hard. There were 2 rooms inside, a main space with a table, wood stove, and a couch, and a smaller back room with a bed. The first 2 days went smoothly. The air was cool, the water of the lake calm, and the forest was quiet except for the usual sounds of birds, the crack of branches, and the distant rush of wind moving through tall pines. I spent most of my time reading, writing, and walking the trails that wound around the property. I liked the isolation, the way the silence made every sound seem important. At night, I kept the lantern low and sat by the window, watching the darkness press against the glass. Out there, it was blacker than anywhere else I had ever stayed. No streetlights, no houses, no headlights, just trees and shadows that seemed endless. On the 3rd night, I heard something strange. I had gone to bed early, the lantern blown out, the cabin dark except for the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. At some point after midnight, I woke up to the crunch of footsteps outside. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the sound was too exact, too evenly spaced, like someone walking on purpose. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My heart pounded hard, and I stared at the ceiling for what felt like an hour, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because I woke up again with sunlight pouring through the window. In the morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had been an animal, and I had imagined the human rhythm of the steps. Still, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground. The dirt around the porch was hard and dry, not great for tracks, but in one patch of softer soil near the woodpile I found something. It was faint, but clear enough to recognize. The shape of a boot print, too large to be mine. I crouched there for a while, staring at it, the woods around me suddenly feeling different, less safe. I wanted to believe it was old, maybe left behind by the last person who stayed here. That made sense. Still, the fact that it was pointed toward the cabin unsettled me. The rest of that day, I couldn't relax. Every sound from the trees made me jump. When I went down to the lake to fetch water, I kept looking over my shoulder. When I chopped firewood, I felt exposed, like someone could be watching me. That night, I locked the door and pushed the small table in front of it. I kept the lantern burning longer than usual, the shadows in the corners of the cabin making me uneasy. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard the faint creak of wood, the kind a cabin makes when weight shifts on the porch boards. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, slow and drawn out, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to be noticed. My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe it was the wind or the cabin settling, but deep down I knew better. I reached for the flashlight I kept by the bed, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I just held it, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. The creak stopped. I waited, every nerve in my body tense. Then I heard another sound, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. The gentle rattle of the door handle. Someone was trying it, testing to see if it was locked. My throat went dry. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The table I had pushed against the door suddenly felt like the only thing keeping me safe. The handle rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. After that, silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door, listening to every tick and groan of the cabin. My ears played tricks on me, turning the smallest noise into something larger. I swore I could hear breathing outside, but I couldn't be sure. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to stay long. I decided to pack up and leave the next day. I told myself I could handle one more night, but I didn't want to risk another after that. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt alive in a way that worked against me, as if they were hiding something I couldn't see. That day dragged on endlessly. I stuck close to the cabin, not wanting to stray too far. I stacked firewood neatly against the wall, pretending to be busy, but my eyes kept darting to the trees. More than once, I thought I saw movement deep among the trunks, a flicker of dark shapes slipping between shadows. But when I focused, there was nothing. I barely ate, just chewed on some bread and canned meat while my stomach churned with nerves. As the sun set, I felt a rising panic. I didn't want the night to come, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The woods grew darker, the last light fading from the lake, and soon the cabin was once again an island of weak lamplight surrounded by miles of black. I checked the lock on the door 3 times. I shoved the table tight against it again, then stacked 2 chairs on top of that for good measure. I closed the curtains tight, though part of me thought maybe I should leave them open so I could see if someone was out there. In the end, I couldn't stand the thought of looking up and seeing a face staring back at me. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat up on the bed with the flashlight and a heavy piece of firewood in my lap. The cabin was quiet, but I knew it wouldn't last. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside. This time, there was no pretending it was an animal. They were slow, steady, circling the cabin just like before. My heart hammered against my ribs. The steps stopped at the back wall, near the bedroom window. I held my breath. A moment later, the faint scrape of a fingernail, or maybe a stick, dragged across the glass. I almost dropped the flashlight. I wanted to scream, but I bit it back, forcing myself to stay quiet. The scraping lasted only a second, then stopped. Silence fell again, thicker than before. I sat there, frozen, until I heard the porch creak again. Whoever it was had moved back to the door. The handle rattled hard, metal clinking. Then the door shook against the barricade I had built. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the flashlight and the wood, ready to swing if I had to. The shaking stopped suddenly, and then there was nothing. Minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. My mouth was dry, my body aching from how tightly I held myself. I don't know how long I sat like that, but eventually exhaustion pulled at me, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. I woke at dawn, stiff and sore, but alive. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the air outside was sharp and cold. The dirt around the porch was marked this time. Boot prints, fresh and deep, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, then at the door. I didn't wait around. I packed my bag fast, shoving everything inside with shaking hands. I killed the lantern, slung the bag over my shoulder, and stepped out. The woods were quiet, but it felt like the silence of someone holding their breath. I locked the cabin door behind me even though I knew it wouldn't matter. Then I started down the trail that led back to the road where my car was parked. Every step felt heavy. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but the woods stayed still. My eyes darted left and right, searching the trees for movement. I walked fast, my breath coming in short bursts, my shoulders tight. The trail felt longer than it had on the way in, every bend dragging on. When I finally reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys. I climbed in, slammed the door, and locked it. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the empty dirt road ahead. Then I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I drove away without looking back. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was high, and I felt like I had stepped back into a different world. People walked down the sidewalks, cars passed by, and everything looked normal, safe, alive. But I knew what had happened out there in the woods wasn't nothing. Someone had been outside that cabin, circling, watching, trying to get in. I never went back. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, tucked away off an old dirt road that barely showed up on the maps. The place had no neighbors, no phone line, and the only way to get there was to drive down a narrow logging road for miles until the trees closed in so much that you could barely see the sky. That was exactly what I wanted. Complete quiet, no interruptions, no one around me. I had been dealing with a lot of noise in my life and I just wanted to be somewhere still. The drive took most of the afternoon. I had packed up my car with enough supplies for several days. Canned food, water, a small generator, fuel, a camping stove, and all the tools I thought I would need. I also had my rifle with me, not because I was expecting to hunt, but because being alone in the woods made me feel better knowing I had something for protection. Black bears were known to roam the area, and though they usually avoided people, I didn't want to take chances. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to drop low behind the treetops. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It was a single-story structure, made from thick logs darkened by years of weather. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, but the roof looked solid. The windows were small, with shutters that could be pulled closed from the inside. There was a stone chimney on one side, and a small woodshed stood about 20 feet away. I spent the first hour unloading the car and getting everything inside. The air was cool and damp, and the woods around me were silent except for the occasional sound of a bird or the rustling of branches high above. The ground was thick with pine needles, and the smell of sap and damp earth was strong. It felt remote, completely cut off. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a wood stove in the center, a small kitchen area with an old propane cooktop, and a single bedroom in the back with a cot and a dresser. There was no electricity aside from what I could run off the generator, and no running water except for a hand pump outside. I set up my gear, got the stove lit to take the edge off the chill, and cooked a small dinner on my camping stove. By the time I finished eating, it was nearly dark outside. The first night was uneventful. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quieter than I expected, just a few insects, an occasional distant crack of a branch, and the faint creak of the cabin settling. Sleep came easily. The next day I spent gathering wood, checking the area around the cabin, and making sure everything was in order. I hiked a little way down the logging road, just to see where it went, but after half an hour of walking, I realized it stretched on endlessly, winding through dense woods with no sign of other people. The isolation was both comforting and unsettling. That night, I noticed something strange. As I sat on the porch with a lantern beside me, I thought I saw movement in the trees beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't clear, just the sense of a shadow shifting between the trunks. At first I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I stayed still and watched, but nothing came closer. Eventually, I went back inside, closed the shutters, and tried to forget about it. The third day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods. I followed a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The forest was thick, with towering pines and undergrowth that made it hard to move quietly. After an hour or so, I came across something that made me uneasy. It was a fire ring, just a circle of stones with some ashes inside. It didn't look old. The ashes were gray but not fully washed away by rain. Someone had camped there recently. The cabin was supposed to be in an unused area. The man who rented it to me said it was private land, no hunters or campers allowed. Seeing that fire pit made me feel watched. I looked around the woods, but everything was still. I didn't hear a single bird, and the silence pressed down in a way that made my skin crawl. I turned back sooner than I planned and went back to the cabin. That night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept the shutters closed, but I heard sounds outside. At first it was faint, like someone stepping on pine needles. Then, later, I heard something scrape lightly against the wall of the cabin. I sat there in the dark, every muscle tight, listening. My rifle was across my lap. The sound stopped after a while, but I hardly slept. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was soft in places, but I didn't see anything clear. Just a few broken twigs and some disturbed pine needles near the edge of the woods. I couldn't be sure if it was from an animal or a person. As the day went on, I kept thinking about the fire pit I had found. If someone was out there, they might still be nearby. I decided to check the woods again, but this time I moved more carefully. About 200 yards from the cabin, I found something that confirmed my fears. A tree had been stripped of bark at shoulder height, and tied around it with twine was a bundle of bones. They looked like deer bones, bleached white, arranged in a crude little cluster. It didn't look like something nature had done. It looked deliberate. My stomach dropped. I backed away slowly, scanning the trees. The woods were silent again, heavy and still. I didn't like it. I went straight back to the cabin and shut myself inside. That evening, I started up the generator to give myself some light, but I didn't keep it running long. The noise seemed too loud, like it would give away my position. I shut it off and went back to using my lantern. As I sat there in the dim glow, I heard the sound again. Footsteps outside. This time, they were slower, more deliberate. They circled the cabin. My heart pounded as I sat perfectly still, gripping the rifle. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then I heard a faint creak of wood, like weight shifting on the first step. I aimed the rifle at the door, waiting, breath held. But after a long silence, the sound moved away. Branches rustled faintly, and then it was quiet again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, staring at the door until dawn. The next day, I considered leaving. I could pack up, drive back down the logging road, and be out of there in a few hours. But part of me resisted. I didn't want to feel chased out. I had paid for the cabin, and I told myself it could all just be my imagination, maybe even a trick of nerves from being alone too long. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that fire pit and those bones tied to the tree. By the fifth night, everything boiled over. It started the same. Small sounds in the woods, faint movements in the shadows. I sat in the dark with the shutters closed, the rifle across my lap. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the cabin door handle moving. Slowly, carefully, like someone was testing it. The door was locked, but I could hear the faint click as the handle shifted back and forth. Then silence. I aimed at the door, my finger tight on the trigger. Every second dragged on like an hour. After a while, the sound faded, replaced by footsteps retreating into the woods. The first light, I packed my things. I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching me, waiting for something. I loaded my car quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling exposed in the open. When I finally got onto the logging road, I drove fast, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But the woods stayed still, swallowing the cabin and everything with it. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only then did I breathe fully, gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. That was the last time I ever went back to that cabin. I told myself I'd wanted peace and quiet, but what I found was something else entirely. Out there, deep in the woods, someone was watching. Someone who didn't want me there. The bones, the fire pit, the footsteps in the night, they were all warnings. I listened, I left, and I never returned. I remember the day I decided to take the trip up to the cabin. It was supposed to be simple, just a few days alone in the woods, away from everything, away from the noise of people and the constant stress of work. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend who had let me use it since he wasn't going up that season. He told me it was quiet, isolated, perfect for anyone who wanted some peace. That was exactly what I thought I needed. I didn't realize at the time that peace and silence, when you're completely alone, can turn into something far different, something heavier, something that weighs on you until it feels like it might crush you. The drive up was long. The cabin sat deep into the forest, miles off the main road, down a dirt track that was almost invisible unless you already knew where to turn. The track wound through thick trees, the kind that blocked out most of the sunlight. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, noticing how the road behind me seemed to close up after each turn, as if the trees swallowed it, leaving no sign I had come that way. My car rattled over rocks and dips in the road, branches brushed against the sides, and the further I went, the more it felt like I was leaving the world behind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dropping low, slipping between the trees in long orange streaks. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with grass growing unevenly around it, and a stack of firewood piled up against one wall. It looked plain and simple, built from dark logs, the kind of place you could miss entirely if you didn't know where to look. There was no other building in sight, no sign of people anywhere nearby, no power lines, no fences, no mailboxes. Just the cabin, the trees, and the endless quiet. I parked in the dirt patch beside it and carried my things inside. The air in the cabin was cool and stale, like it hadn't been opened in weeks. Dust hung in the light that came through the single front window. The place was small, just one main room with a bed against the far wall, a wood stove, a small table, and some shelves stocked with cans and jars. A narrow door in the back led to a tiny bathroom with no plumbing except a bucket and a jug for washing. I had brought water with me, since I didn't trust whatever might be in the nearby creek. When I shut the door and stood there in the middle of the room, the silence hit me fully. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a quiet house in the city, where you still hear distant cars, voices, or the hum of appliances. This was total silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the wooden walls settling or the faint rustle of leaves outside. It made me strangely aware of every little sound I made myself. My breathing, the scuff of my shoes on the floor, the creak of the bed springs when I set my bag down. First, it was peaceful. I cooked some canned food on the stove, ate, and sat outside for a while as the light faded. The woods around me grew darker, the trees blending together into a single wall of black, the sky fading from orange to gray to nothing but stars. I didn't hear a single bird, not even crickets, just the faint wind shifting through the branches. When the cold started to bite, I went inside, locked the door, and lay on the bed. The mattress was thin, the blanket rough, but I felt safe enough. That first night was when the unease began. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The cabin was pitch black, the kind of black where you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. At first I thought it was a dream, because I was lying there wide awake, but couldn't remember hearing anything that had stirred me. Then slowly I became aware of a sound. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, a steady crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound came again, irregular, sometimes closer, sometimes further, circling the cabin. Someone, or something, was moving out there in the dark. I felt my whole body tense up, my chest tight, my throat dry. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the weight of the steps seemed too heavy for that. They sounded measured, like a person walking slowly, carefully, trying not to be noticed. The sound went on for what felt like forever. At times it stopped completely, leaving me straining into the silence, wondering if whoever it was had gone. Then it would start again, just a few slow steps, close enough that I imagined someone standing right outside the thin wooden walls, listening. My mind filled with images I didn't want. Someone waiting just beyond the door, someone crouched by the window, staring in. I didn't move a muscle. I just lay there, every nerve in my body sharp, counting each breath. Eventually, after what must have been hours, the sound faded away into the distance. I stayed awake until the first light crept in through the cracks around the window, not daring to sleep again. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, soft enough to hide most prints. But I found patches where the leaves had been disturbed, pressed down in a way that didn't look natural. Long, uneven marks, as if boots had scraped across the ground. I stood there staring at them, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things in the half-light of morning. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been out there. That day, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin, every sway of the trees outside, made me jump. I tried to distract myself, chopping wood, writing in a notebook I had brought, walking a short distance into the woods to gather more water. But the feeling never left me, the sense that I wasn't alone. Several times I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flicker of something pale against the dark trunks. But when I stared, there was nothing there. By nightfall, my nerves were stretched thin. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and lay in bed fully dressed. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by every noise. Around midnight, I woke again, this time to a different sound. It was faint but sharp, the slow scrape of wood against metal. My blood ran cold. It was the sound of the doorknob being tested. I lay frozen, staring into the dark, listening. The knob rattled softly once, then again. Someone was trying the door, gently, carefully, as if they didn't want to wake me. The chair under the handle creaked but held firm. After a while, the rattling stopped and silence returned. I didn't move until morning. When the sun rose, I checked the door. The knob had faint smudges on it, fresh against the layer of dust. The sight of them made my stomach twist. Whoever it was had been right there, just a thin door between us. I thought about leaving that day. I packed my bag, even carried it out to the car, but when I sat behind the wheel, I froze. The dirt road back through the woods stretched ahead, narrow and twisting, and I realized how easy it would be for someone to block it, to follow me, to force me to stop. Out here, there was no cell signal, no way to call for help. I told myself I would be safer staying put, at least for one more day. Maybe it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe it was nothing. I put the bag back inside, but it wasn't nothing. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. The footsteps circled again, slower, more deliberate, stopping every so often as if to listen. I heard faint breathing outside the window, soft but unmistakable, the sound of air fogging against the cold glass. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. At one point, something brushed against the wall, a dragging sound, like fingers trailing along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the small axe I had left by the stove and sat upright in bed, gripping it tightly, waiting. My mouth was dry, my body trembling, but I kept staring at the door, ready for it to move. Hours dragged by, and eventually, as before, the sounds faded. By the fourth night, I was nearly broken. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, my hands shook constantly, and every shadow looked like someone standing there. That night, the noises didn't circle. They came straight to the door, heavy footsteps, fast, confident. The knob rattled hard, the chair shuddered. Then came a solid thump against the wood, like a shoulder being pressed into it. Another, harder this time. The walls shook. I sat there clutching the axe, my body frozen between terror and the instinct to fight. I was certain the door would break, that whoever it was would come crashing in. But after several more blows, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because I didn't know if they were still there, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the gray light of morning finally seeped in, I forced myself to open the door and look outside. The ground was torn up, fresh boot prints deep in the dirt, leading away into the woods. They were big, clear, and deliberate. Someone had been there, no doubt left. That was enough. I packed my bag again, threw it in the car, and this time I didn't hesitate. I drove fast down that dirt road, the branches slapping the sides of the car, the tires sliding on loose rocks. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting I had been planning to spend a week alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods, far away from everything I knew. I told myself it would be quiet, relaxing, and a way to clear my head. I had been feeling tired of the noise of the city, the endless movement of cars, the flashing lights, and the way I was never really alone no matter where I went. I wanted the silence of nature, the sound of wind in the trees, the smell of pine, the crunch of dirt under my boots. I wanted to wake up to stillness, spend my days with nothing but the sound of birds, and fall asleep at night to nothing but the creak of the wooden beams above me. I booked the cabin online through a small listing. The pictures showed a single-story wooden structure tucked between tall pine trees with a small porch and a stone fireplace inside. The listing mentioned there was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no television, and no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed my truck with a week's worth of food, extra clothes, a small cooler with ice, a lantern, batteries, a good knife, and a heavy flashlight. I brought an old sleeping bag just in case the bed felt uncomfortable. The drive out there took nearly 6 hours. The last stretch of road was rough gravel that snaked through dense forest. The trees leaned over the road, their branches touching in places, and the deeper I went, the darker it got. By the time I saw the small clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because I had made it without getting lost. Unease because the place looked so cut off it almost felt like I had stepped outside the normal world. The cabin was simple, built of dark logs that looked aged but solid. The porch had 2 wooden chairs, a stack of cut firewood against one wall, and an old axe stuck in a stump nearby. I carried my bags inside and looked around. There was one main room with a bed pushed against the wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, the stone fireplace in the corner, and shelves with a few old pots and pans. A single window looked out toward the trees. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and dust. First, I enjoyed it. I unpacked, made myself a sandwich, and walked around the clearing to get a feel for the place. The air felt colder under the trees, and the quiet was so complete that even my footsteps on the ground sounded too loud. I stayed close to the cabin the first evening, building a fire in the fireplace as the sun went down. The fire gave off a warm glow that lit up the small space, and I lay on the bed listening to the crackle of the wood until I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early. Sunlight leaked through the window, and the forest outside was filled with the sound of birds. I cooked some eggs on a small portable stove I had brought and ate them slowly, looking out the window at the trees swaying gently. For a while, it felt like the perfect escape, but by the second night, something felt different. It started with the sounds outside. I expected the normal noises of the woods at night, crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, maybe the distant call of an animal. Instead, I noticed stretches of complete silence broken by sharp sounds that didn't fit, twigs snapping as if someone stepped on them, a dragging noise that seemed to move across the ground near the treeline. At first, I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer moving around, or a raccoon searching for food. But the noises didn't come from random directions like you'd expect from animals. They circled. They moved slowly around the cabin, always keeping some distance but never fading entirely. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, my ears tuned to every creak of the wood and every sound outside. The fire had gone out, and the cabin had grown cold. I pulled the sleeping bag around me and tried to force myself to sleep, but my eyes kept snapping open every time I thought I heard something closer than before. The following day, I felt tired but tried to ignore it. I went for a walk down the rough path that led away from the cabin. It wound through the woods and eventually reached a narrow stream. I knelt to splash some cold water on my face and sat on a rock for a while. The stillness felt heavier that morning. Even the birds seemed quieter. I turned back after an hour and returned to the cabin, noticing as I walked that the ground near the trees looked disturbed in places, as though the dirt had been scraped or dragged. I tried not to think much of it. That night, it got worse. I had locked the cabin door, slid the bolt across, and checked the windows twice before lying down. I left the lantern on this time, the dim glow filling the room. Around midnight, the sounds started again. A crunch in the leaves outside, a slow step, another, then silence. My heart pounded as I listened. I gripped the heavy flashlight, holding it against my chest. After several minutes, I heard it again, closer this time. A steady dragging noise, as though something heavy was being pulled across the ground. It stopped near the porch. I held my breath, staring at the door. The old wood creaked softly under pressure, not enough to open but enough that I knew something, or someone, was standing there. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, until after what felt like hours, the sound faded back into the trees. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The ground near the porch showed marks, long, shallow grooves in the dirt, almost like something had been dragged in a line. I found footprints too, faint but there. They were human, not animal. The sight made my stomach drop. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was some old marks in the dirt I hadn't noticed before, but I knew that wasn't true. I had walked around the cabin the day I arrived, and none of those marks were there then. By the fourth night, I was too on edge to rest. I kept the fire burning low and sat at the table with the flashlight in my hand. The noises came again, circling, dragging, pausing for long stretches. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window, just at the edge of the trees. A figure, still, watching. But when I shone the flashlight, the beam caught only empty trunks and branches. I barely slept at all. My body ached with exhaustion. The following day, I thought about leaving, but the cabin was deep in the forest, and the nearest town was hours away. Driving that long on almost no sleep felt dangerous. I told myself I could handle one more night, and then I would pack up in the morning and go. That night was the worst. The noises didn't just stay outside. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the faint creak of the porch boards. My body froze. The dragging sound moved across the porch itself. Then silence. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook the bed. I gripped the flashlight tighter, staring at the door. I didn't move, afraid any sound would give me away. A moment later, the handle turned. Slowly, the locked door held, but the sound of the handle rattling back and forth filled the cabin. My throat felt dry as I sat up in bed, too terrified to move. The handle kept turning, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then the dragging sound returned, moving away from the porch, fading into the trees again. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I packed my bags in a rush, stuffing everything into the truck. My hands shook as I loaded the cooler, the lantern, and my clothes. I checked the cabin one last time, making sure I hadn't left anything, then got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive out of the woods felt endless. Every shadow between the trees made me flinch. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally reached the main road, the relief that washed over me felt almost overwhelming. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station an hour outside the forest. I parked, went inside, and stood there for a long time, just surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the presence of other people. When I finally got home that night, I unpacked my things slowly. That was when I noticed the detail that made my stomach twist worse than anything else. On the side of my cooler, near the handle, was a streak of dirt. It wasn't there before. The shape of it was clear, 5 long marks, like the outline of a hand dragged across it. I never went back to that cabin. I had rented the cabin because I needed time away from people. I had been working too much, dealing with too many things in the city, and I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere where the noise of cars and phones and everything else could not reach me. The cabin was small, built of old wood that had darkened with age. It was set back from a dirt road that hardly anyone used, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the light. When I first pulled up to it, I felt a strange calmness, like I had finally managed to step outside of my own life. The air was sharp and clean, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. The inside of the cabin was simple. A single main room with a fireplace against one wall, a kitchen corner with a propane stove, and a small bedroom at the back with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. There was no electricity. There was no running water. I had brought containers of water, food that would keep, and a lantern with extra fuel. I had thought it all through because I wanted to be prepared and not need to leave. The first day was quiet. I unpacked, stacked firewood near the door, and swept out the dust that had gathered on the floor. The sun went down quickly behind the trees, and the shadows outside pressed against the windows until the cabin felt like it was floating in blackness. The night was darker than anything I had known in the city. When I blew out the lantern and lay down on the mattress, it was like lying in the middle of nothing. I could hear my own breathing too clearly. I could hear every tiny crack of the wood as the cabin cooled. I did not sleep well. The second day I felt better. I made a fire and boiled water for coffee on the little stove. I walked along the dirt road for a while, just to see where it led, but it curved away into the forest and I turned back before long. It was enough just to move and breathe and not hear anyone else. I spent the afternoon writing in a notebook I had brought, sitting near the fireplace while the fire gave off slow heat. I told myself this trip would be good for me, that I would return to the city more rested. But that night something changed. It started with a sound. I had been lying in bed, the lantern blown out, the darkness heavy. I was close to sleep when I heard the crunch of something outside. At first I thought it was an animal, The forest was full of them. A raccoon, a deer, maybe even a bear. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped outside the cabin, right near the front door. The cabin was small, and the door was only a few feet from where I lay. The walls were thin. I could hear the faint creak of the porch boards. Someone was standing out there. I did not move. I did not light the lantern. I lay still and tried to make my breathing quiet. The sound of the boards shifting under weight went on for a moment, and then it was silent. I thought maybe whoever it was had gone. But then I heard a faint tap at the window. Not hard, not like someone knocking, but light, like the brush of a finger. My chest felt tight. I did not get up. I stayed still for hours, until finally exhaustion forced me to sleep in short, broken pieces. When I woke the next morning, light was filtering through the cracks in the curtains. I got up slowly and went to the window. There were marks on the glass, smudges, as though someone had touched it with dirty hands. I went to the door and stepped outside. The ground around the porch was soft from old rain, and in the mud I saw them. Footprints, human footprints. They led up to the door and then away again, back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring into the forest. The trees stood close together, their shadows deep. Whoever had been there was gone now, but I could not stop thinking of how close they had come, how they had stood right outside while I lay in the dark. I tried to push it out of my head during the day. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker or someone passing by. But the cabin was not near any trail. It was too far out. No one should have been walking there. That night I could not relax. I lit the lantern and left it burning. I kept the fire going, the crackle of it steady, trying to comfort myself. But as the hours passed and the cabin sank into darkness again, I felt watched. My skin prickled as though eyes were on me. I listened for every sound, every shift in the wood. And then it came again. The crunch of steps outside. Slow, steady, deliberate. I froze. The lantern flame flickered. The steps came to the porch. The boards groaned under weight. Then silence. I gripped the handle of the axe I had brought for chopping wood. My hand was sweating. I sat in the chair by the fire, holding it, not moving, not breathing too loud. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, faintly, from the back of the cabin, I heard it. A scrape along the wall, like fingers dragging over the wood. Then another tap at the window. It went on for hours. Movement outside, light sounds, never strong enough to be certain, but never stopping long enough for me to believe it was over. When dawn came, I opened the door again. The ground around the cabin was covered in prints. They circled the cabin, weaving in and out, stopping by each window. Someone had walked around me all night while I sat inside. I felt sick. I felt exposed. I was miles from anyone. No phone, no car close by, just the trees and the dirt road. Whoever it was knew I was alone. I thought about leaving. I packed some food into a bag and set it near the door. But I stayed. I told myself I might be overreacting. I told myself maybe it was kids or some drifter who would move on. I tried to believe it. The next night was worse. I heard the footsteps earlier, just after the sun had gone down. This time they did not stop at the porch. They moved around, circling the cabin. I could hear them stop under the window, then move again, then stop. My heart was racing so hard I thought it would burst. I held the axe tight in my lap and sat on the bed, waiting. The lantern light made shadows jump across the walls. At one point, I thought I saw a shape pass across the window, just for a second. A dark figure against the lighter night. I stayed awake until morning, shaking, my body stiff from sitting so still. When I stepped outside, there were more prints, this time closer, right under the windows, right up against the walls. I realized then that I could not stay. Whoever it was, they were not leaving. They were watching me, circling me, waiting. I did not know what they wanted, but I knew I would not be safe. I packed quickly. I loaded my bag with food, water, the lantern, and the axe. I stepped out onto the road just as the sun was rising. The air was cold, my breath showing white. I started walking fast, my eyes flicking to the trees on either side, expecting at any moment to see someone there. The road stretched long and empty, the forest pressed in. Every sound of a branch snapping or leaves shifting made me spin around. I felt like I was being followed. I kept walking, faster and faster, until my legs ached and my throat burned from breathing. After hours, I finally saw another road, wider, with signs of use. Relief flooded me so strong I almost collapsed. I followed it until, eventually, I reached a small store on the edge of a town. People stared at me as I walked in, dirty and shaking, clutching the axe. I never went back to the cabin. I never even went near that forest again. Sometimes I think about the nights I spent there, listening to the footsteps, the tapping on the glass. Whoever it was never showed themselves. They never tried to break in. They only circled, watched, and waited. That was what made it worse. The not knowing. The endless hours of being aware that someone was out there, close enough to touch the walls of the place I was in, but never letting me see their face. I left, but I still hear it sometimes in my head when I am alone at night. The crunch of steps in the dark, the faint tap at the window, the sense of someone standing just outside, waiting. That is the part that never leaves. I had always liked the idea of being away from everything for a while, cut off from noise, people, and the weight of daily routines. That was why I decided to spend some time at a cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. He used it during hunting season, but most of the year it sat empty. It was small, set deep in the woods and far away from town. There was no phone line and no cell signal once you passed the first stretch of dirt road that wound up into the hills. The nearest store was a good hour away by car, and the last few miles had to be driven slowly because of the rough trail. I thought it would be perfect. A week alone, no work, no messages, no distractions. Just me, a stack of books, some simple food I brought along, and the quiet of the forest. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. It had a single bedroom, a living space with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a porch that looked out toward the trees. Behind it stretched nothing but thick forest for miles. There was a small shed next to it where tools and firewood were kept. Inside, everything smelled of old wood and faint smoke, the kind of smell that sticks to cabins over the years. The first day passed easily. I carried in my supplies, unpacked my things, and swept the floor, which had gathered a thin layer of dust since the last time someone had been there. I filled a pot with water from the nearby stream and boiled it to be safe. I had brought bottled water too, but I liked the idea of using what the place naturally offered. As the evening came, I lit the lantern and ate a simple meal of rice and beans. That night, I slept well. The forest was quiet, except for the distant hooting of an owl and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The cabin's walls creaked lightly as the temperature dropped, but that was normal. I had no trouble falling asleep, wrapped in a heavy blanket, listening to the wood stove crackle. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The woods were dense but beautiful. Fallen leaves covered the ground, and the air smelled fresh and damp. I followed the stream for a while, then cut back through a patch of tall pines. I noticed a few signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, scat near the bushes, but nothing unusual. When I came back, I chopped some firewood to keep busy and stacked it by the wall. By evening, I was tired but calm, and I enjoyed the sense of being away from the world. It was the third night when things began to shift. I had gone to bed early, around 9. The lantern was out, and only the faint orange glow of the stove lit the room. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just because I had turned over in my sleep, but then I realized I had heard something. It was faint, but it was there, a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise. It was a footstep. I lay completely still in the dark, holding my breath. I told myself it could have been a branch snapping, or maybe a raccoon moving around near the porch. But the sound came again, slow and heavy, like someone stepping on dry leaves just outside the cabin. My heart began to pound. The nearest house was miles away. Nobody had any reason to be out here, especially in the middle of the night. I kept listening, staring at the faint outlines of the room, waiting for another sound. After a while, it stopped. I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. I waited, tense, but eventually, I told myself it must have been an animal after all. Reluctantly, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The porch was clear, and the ground didn't show anything obvious. But as I walked around the side of the cabin, I froze. There, in the soft dirt near the shed, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I had boots with thick tread, but these were flat, like worn sneakers. The prints circled near the shed and then disappeared back into the trees. I felt uneasy, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost and passed by. Maybe someone had been curious about the cabin but meant no harm. Still, it didn't explain why they would be there in the middle of the night. That day, I tried to focus on other things. I read for a while, cooked a meal, and tried to shake the thought from my head. But I couldn't. I found myself checking the windows often, looking out into the trees, listening for any sign of movement. When night came again, I felt tense. I made sure the doors were locked, the windows shut, and the lantern close by. I loaded a few logs into the stove and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again. This time, the sound was clearer. Someone was walking slowly on the porch. The boards creaked under their weight. I stayed frozen in bed, heart hammering, staring toward the door. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard a soft scrape, like fingers brushing against the wood of the wall. I wanted to shout, to make noise, but I kept still. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded. In the morning, I checked again. There were fresh prints on the porch, smudged and muddy. Someone had definitely been there. I thought about leaving. I could pack my things and drive back down the road. But I told myself maybe it was just someone passing through, someone who wouldn't come back. That night proved me wrong. Started the same, footsteps, slow and deliberate. But this time, they didn't stop at the porch. I heard the handle of the door rattle. It was locked, but they tried it, shaking it gently. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense, staring at the door in the dim light. The rattling stopped, but then I heard movement around the cabin, circling, pausing by the windows. The faint sound of breathing reached me through the thin glass. I grabbed the axe I had left by the woodpile earlier and held it tight, sitting there in the dark, waiting. They didn't get in, but they stayed a long time, moving around outside, testing the walls, brushing against the wood, until finally, after hours, the sounds faded into the distance. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bag, shoved my supplies back into the car, and started the drive out. But the dirt road was rough, and halfway down, I realized one of my tires was flat. When I got out to check, I saw it had been slashed. Not punctured by a rock, not torn by accident. Slashed clean through with something sharp. Panic rose in my chest. Someone had done this on purpose. I had no choice but to drive slowly on the spare, praying it would hold long enough to get me back to town. The road felt endless, every bend making me glance at the trees, expecting to see someone step out. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the paved road. The spare tire held, and I didn't stop until I saw the first gas station. I never went back to that cabin again. Later, when I told my friend about it, he seemed surprised but admitted he had once found strange signs near the shed too. He thought maybe someone used the forest as a hiding place, someone who didn't want to be seen. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, if I had stayed one more night, if I hadn't left when I did, I might not have made it out at all. I went to the cabin at the start of fall, thinking it would be a quiet escape from the noise of the city. The cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle, and it was tucked away deep in the woods, far from paved roads or even regular trails. I had been told it was isolated, but I did not realize just how cut off it was until I parked my truck at the end of the old dirt road and saw the path I had to walk. The trail was narrow, covered in leaves, and seemed like it had not been properly used in years. I carried 2 bags, one with food and supplies, and another with clothes and basic gear. I had no real plan except to spend a week alone, reading, cooking simple meals, maybe hiking around during the day, and resting at night. I thought the stillness would clear my head. The cabin itself was small, built of dark wood that had aged with time. The roof sagged slightly, but it held together. There was a porch with a broken railing and a door that looked like it had been replaced once but not painted to match the rest. Inside, the floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the light that slipped through the single window facing the trees. There was a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small shelf with old books and jars of nails, and a mattress on a wooden frame pushed against the wall. There was no running water, no electricity, and no phone service. I had known this beforehand and thought it would make the stay feel more genuine. I brought a lantern, extra fuel, and enough batteries for a flashlight. The first night felt calm. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, sat at the table, and listened to the quiet. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring. In the city, even late at night, there is always some background hum. Cars, voices, sirens, or the wind bouncing off buildings. Here, there was nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin wood and the faint rustle of leaves outside. When I went to bed, I lay awake for a long time listening. At first it was peaceful, but after hours it turned unsettling. Every sound outside felt sharper. A twig snapping, an owl hooting, the brush of branches in the wind. It all stood out like it was happening right beside me. On the second day, I walked around the woods near the cabin. The ground was uneven, covered in moss, dead leaves, and roots that curled up like veins. The air was damp, and the smell of wet soil clung to everything. I carried a small hatchet and a canteen of water. After about an hour of walking, I noticed there were no signs of trails, no markers, not even the usual worn paths that animals make. It felt like a place people rarely entered. When I returned, I cut some wood for the stove and tried to settle back into the stillness. But by the time the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floor, I was already restless. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was sharp, like wood cracking, and it made me sit up immediately. I held my breath and waited. The lantern was out, and the cabin was dark except for the moonlight through the window. After a long pause, there was another noise, softer this time, like something brushing against the wall. I gripped the flashlight, but I did not turn it on. I stayed still, trying to decide if it was just branches in the wind. But the air was still. The night felt so heavy and unmoving that even the small sound carried too clearly. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten, and only then did I let myself relax a little. By the third day, I started noticing details I had not seen before. On the far side of the cabin, near the tree line, there were small patches of disturbed soil, like something had been dug up. At first I thought it was from animals, maybe wild pigs or raccoons, but the holes were too neat, too clean, as if dug by a tool. Some were shallow, no deeper than a foot, while others looked recently filled back in. The dirt was loose and darker than the ground around it. I crouched near one of them, poked at the soil with a stick, and felt a nervous chill run down my back. The holes were too close to the cabin, almost like they had been made on purpose. That night was worse. I tried to sleep early, but again I woke to noises outside. This time it was footsteps. At first I thought I imagined them, but the pattern was too steady. Crunching leaves, pausing, crunching again. Slow, deliberate, they circled the cabin. My throat tightened, and I barely breathed. I thought about stepping outside with the hatchet, but the thought of opening the door and seeing someone there froze me in place. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight and hatchet, waiting. Hours passed before I heard the steps fade into the woods. When I finally fell asleep, it was morning. The following day, I checked around the cabin. The soil patches looked freshly disturbed again, like someone had dug another hole and then filled it back in. The ground was soft, and the edges were marked with impressions that looked too straight to be animal prints. I found myself scanning the trees constantly, looking for movement, half expecting to see someone watching. My chest felt tight, and the woods no longer seemed quiet but hostile. I started rationing food differently, realizing I might leave earlier than planned. I had brought enough for a week, but I didn't want to stay another 3 nights if things continued like this. That night, I stacked wood against the inside of the door, not enough to keep it closed if someone really tried, but enough to make noise if it opened. I turned the lantern off and lay awake. The noises came again. Footsteps, slower this time, and then a long silence. I thought maybe they had left, but then there was a soft scratching on the wall near the window. My skin crawled, and I forced myself not to move. After what felt like forever, the scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of digging. The noise of soil being moved was faint but clear. Someone was digging another hole right outside. I felt frozen, my body stiff with fear. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted. I stepped outside with the hatchet, my hands trembling, and checked the area. Another patch of loose soil had appeared, this one closer to the cabin than the rest. The ground was freshly turned, damp, and messy. I stared at it, and the air felt colder than before. Whoever was out there was coming closer each night. That day, I stayed mostly inside, too uneasy to wander far. I kept thinking about leaving, but the walk back to the truck would take nearly an hour, and if whoever was out there saw me leave, I would be exposed the entire way. I decided to wait until morning. If I left at first light, I could get to the truck while there was still some cover of dim daylight. I packed most of my things before nightfall, keeping only the lantern, hatchet, and flashlight out. That night, the footsteps came back, but this time they didn't circle. They stopped right by the door. The sound was heavy and close, the boards of the porch creaking under weight. I sat up in bed, clutching the hatchet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The door rattled softly, not forced open, but touched, like someone was testing it. Then came silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't hear them leave, but eventually, exhaustion dragged me down into a light, uneasy sleep. At first light, I grabbed my bags and stepped outside. The air was cold, and mist hung low over the ground. Near the porch, right beside the steps, was another hole. This one was deeper than the rest, nearly 3 feet down, with the soil piled up beside it. I stared at it, unable to breathe. It was the size of a grave. My chest tightened, and I felt sick. I didn't waste another second. I hurried down the path, my boots slipping on damp leaves, my bags banging against my sides. I kept glancing back, expecting to see someone following, but the woods were still, quiet except for my steps and my breathing. It took nearly an hour, but I reached the truck, threw everything in the back, and started the engine. The sound of it roared too loudly in the silence, but I didn't care. I drove down the dirt road as fast as I could without sliding, my hands tight on the wheel, eyes darting between the trees. When I reached the paved road, I finally let out a shaky breath, but the feeling in my chest didn't ease. I couldn't stop thinking about the holes, especially the last one. Someone had been digging around that cabin at night, closer each time, until the final one was right by the door, deep and wide like it was meant for me. I never went back to that cabin. I had been planning the trip for months. Life in the city had drained me more than I realized, and I needed a break from the noise, the constant traffic, the endless movement of people, and the feeling that I could never breathe fully. I wanted somewhere far away, quiet, a place where I could sit down and hear nothing but the sound of nature. That was what led me to the cabin. It wasn't one of those neat, polished rental cabins you see online with hot tubs and fancy decks. This one was old, plain, a single-story wooden structure that had probably been sitting in the woods for 50 years or more. The pictures online made it look basic, but it was affordable, and the listing promised total solitude. It was about 2 hours outside the nearest small town, down unmarked dirt roads, surrounded by trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. That was what sold me on it. I drove up there in my old car, the trunk loaded with groceries, bottled water, firewood bundles, and some tools in case anything went wrong. I figured I'd be staying for nights. That was long enough to clear my head without feeling like I had abandoned life completely. The directions were rough. I had to rely on GPS most of the way, but the last 10 miles were nothing but gravel and dirt. My car bounced and rattled as I followed the long track deeper into the woods. Every turn seemed the same, and after a while I wondered if I'd gone in circles. But then the road opened into a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. The place was rougher than I expected. The wood was dark, weathered, and sagging in places. The roof looked patched together, and the windows were cloudy with dirt. There was a small porch with 2 steps, one of them cracked. Behind it stretched the forest, thick and quiet. It was mid-afternoon, the air cool, and the whole place felt still. I turned off the car and sat there for a minute, listening. There was no traffic, no voices, not even the sound of a plane overhead. Just the faint stir of wind moving through branches and an occasional bird call. It was the kind of silence that could make you nervous if you weren't used to it. Inside, the cabin was as plain as the outside. One small room with a kitchen area, a table, and a couple of wooden chairs. There was a wood stove for heat, and against the far wall, a short hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture looked mismatched, probably scavenged from different places over the years. The smell inside was of old wood and dust, with a faint hint of dampness. I unpacked my things, set food in the small fridge that ran on propane, stacked wood beside the stove, and then stepped outside again. I felt the strange excitement of being completely alone, far away from anyone. I walked around the cabin slowly, taking it in from every side. Behind it, the woods pressed close, tall trees packed together, their trunks dark with age. The ground was covered in layers of leaves and pine needles, soft under my boots. I spent the first evening settling in. I cooked a simple meal, read by lantern light since the cabin didn't have electricity, and went to bed early. The silence was so thick it was almost heavy. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, sirens, people. Here, there was nothing. It took me a long time to fall asleep because I kept hearing faint cracks and rustles outside. Every time I tried to relax, a branch would snap somewhere in the woods, or leaves would crunch faintly as though something was moving out there. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. That thought didn't comfort me much, but I eventually drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee on the stove. I stepped outside onto the porch with my mug. The clearing was bathed in gray light, mist still clinging to the trees. The air was cold enough to see my breath. I felt that same peaceful silence again, but it was mixed with a faint unease I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just how isolated the place was. If something happened, if I got hurt, there was no one around for miles. That kind of thought makes you alert in a way you can't fully control. I decided to take a walk down the dirt road. I wanted to stretch my legs and see how far the forest stretched. I walked about a mile before the road dipped into a gully and disappeared into thicker woods. I turned back. On the way, I noticed something strange. The soft dirt on the road showed a set of tracks. At first, I thought they were deer prints, but when I crouched to look closer, I saw they were boot prints. Human footprints, deep in the dirt, heading toward the cabin. That made me pause. I hadn't seen another person since I left town, and the directions to the cabin weren't easy. Whoever had walked there had either been to the cabin themselves or was passing by for some reason. But there wasn't anywhere to pass by to. This road dead-ended at the cabin clearing. The prints looked a day or two old. The edges were a little soft, not freshly made, but still clear enough to see the tread. My stomach felt tight as I stood there staring at them. I forced myself to brush it off. Maybe they were from the owner or someone checking the place before I rented it. I walked back to the cabin, trying to push the thought aside, but I couldn't help glancing into the woods every few minutes. That night, it was harder to sleep. The noises outside seemed louder, closer. At one point, I heard a long, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled slowly across the ground. My skin prickled as I lay there in the dark. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a tree branch falling or maybe some animal rooting through the leaves. But the sound went on longer than it should have, stopping and starting, until I felt sure something or someone was moving around the clearing. I didn't get much sleep. By morning, I was tense and tired. I told myself I was overthinking everything, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to spend more time outside during the day to get used to the place. I chopped some firewood, walked the edge of the clearing, and even set up a chair on the porch to sit with a book. But around noon, I noticed something that froze me in place. Out near the tree-line, maybe 40 yards from the cabin, there was a shape. At first, I thought it was just a tree trunk, but then I realized it was a man. He was standing half-hidden behind a tree, facing the cabin. He wasn't moving. My chest went cold. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but when I looked again, I saw him clearly. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and standing so still it was almost unnatural. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call out, but my throat felt dry. The second thought was to go back inside the cabin, which I did slowly, trying not to show panic. I locked the door, though I knew the locks were flimsy. I stood there in the silence, heart hammering. When I finally got the courage to look through the window again, he was gone. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept checking the woods, but I didn't see him again. I told myself maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just the shape of a tree. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone was out there, watching. That night was worse than the others. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps on the porch. My body froze. They were slow, careful, moving across the wooden boards just feet from where I lay in the dark. The door rattled once, gently, as if someone was testing the lock. Then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping a heavy flashlight like a weapon. The next morning, I wanted nothing more than to leave. But when I went to start my car, I found the driver's side tire slashed. The rubber hung in shreds, cut deep and deliberate. I checked the others, 2 more were flat. My stomach dropped. Whoever was out there didn't just want to scare me. They wanted me stuck. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table trying to think. My phone had no signal. There was no way to call for help. The road was too long to walk back to town in one day, especially with no clear idea of the direction after so many turns. My best chance was to wait for someone to come, maybe the owner checking in or another car driving by. But I realized quickly how unlikely that was. The day dragged on. Every time I looked outside, I felt like eyes were on me, even if I couldn't see him. I stopped going near the windows. I cooked just enough food to eat and then sat in the corner of the room with my flashlight and the firewood axe, waiting for night. When it came, the noises started again. This time, they weren't just around the cabin. They were on the porch. I heard scraping against the wall like metal dragging over wood, then faint tapping on the window glass. My chest tightened with fear so sharp it made me nauseous. I sat there, sweating, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or the door being forced open. But it didn't come. Whoever was out there seemed content to let me know they were there, waiting, keeping me from sleeping, wearing me down. The third night was the worst. I had barely eaten. My nerves were shot, every sound making me jump. I heard movement all around the cabin. Footsteps circling, crunching leaves, the sound of something heavy bumping against the wall. I tried to stay awake, but at some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, it was to the sound of the back door creaking. The cabin only had one back door, narrow and crooked, with I went to the cabin to get away from everything for a while. The place was small and deep in the woods, about a 40-minute drive from the closest town, and then another 20 minutes down a narrow dirt road that twisted through trees and climbed over roots that seemed to grow right through the path. I had been there before, but only during the daytime. Staying alone overnight was something I hadn't done. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, maybe even help me clear my head. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. It sat on a small clearing with tall pine trees circling it, their tops leaning slightly from years of heavy winds. The siding was old wood, darkened by rain and time, and the roof was patched in places with metal sheets that caught a little shine when the sun came through. A small porch stretched across the front, the boards creaking under my weight when I first stepped on them. There was no running water, just a hand pump by the side that drew from a shallow well, and no electricity except for an old generator in the shed behind it. The windows were single panes, some a little warped, and the door had a heavy lock but still felt like it could be forced if someone really tried. I brought food, water, a few basic tools, and enough fuel to run the generator for a few hours at night if I wanted light. I told myself I'd use lanterns instead, to keep the noise down, but I liked knowing I had backup power. I had packed a sleeping bag, thick blankets, a first aid kit, and some spare clothes. I thought I had prepared well. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, swept the floor, and checked the corners for any signs of animals nesting inside. I found a few mouse droppings near the back wall, nothing surprising in a place like that. I set traps just in case. I stacked firewood by the stove and tested the pump outside. The water ran a little cloudy at first, but then cleared. I filled 2 buckets and set them inside. The air was cool, even in the afternoon, and I could already feel the dampness of the forest settling into the walls. As evening came, I sat on the porch, eating a simple meal from a can while the sun sank behind the trees. The forest grew darker faster than I expected. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and soon the only light was a faint blue glow in the sky. By the time I finished eating, it was nearly dark. I lit a lantern and carried it inside. The cabin was small, one main room with a stove, a table, and a bed frame with a thin mattress. There was a small back room used for storage, but nothing much in it except some rusty tools and old jars. I set my lantern on the table, unrolled my sleeping bag on the mattress, and organized my things. I thought about turning on the generator, but I didn't like the idea of the steady noise running outside while I was alone. It made me feel like it would cover other sounds. I wanted silence. That night, the silence was heavier than I expected. No cars, no hum of appliances, no distant voices, only the forest. At first, I heard crickets and the occasional bird settling in, but as it grew late, those sounds faded. What replaced them were noises that were harder to explain. Branches snapped in the distance. Something heavy moved through leaves. I told myself it was deer. There were plenty in the area. Sometimes I thought I heard something closer, like steps crunching on the ground just beyond the clearing, but I convinced myself it was just my mind pulling patterns from random noises. Still, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the mattress inside my sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling while the lantern flickered low. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear another crack outside or the brush of something against the wall. Once I thought I heard the porch creak. I froze, barely breathing, listening for it again. Nothing followed, so I forced myself to calm down. I told myself with shifts, cabins settle, animals move around. It was natural. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes, the lantern was out and faint light was coming through the windows. Morning had arrived, gray and damp, with fog clinging to the clearing. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. That was when I noticed the first thing that bothered me. In the soft dirt near the porch, I saw marks. They weren't clear footprints, more like pressed patches where the soil had shifted. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape wasn't right. They looked wide, like the flat sole of a boot, but smeared as if whoever made them didn't lift their feet completely. I crouched down and touched the dirt. It was still damp, but I couldn't tell how fresh the marks were. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, I told myself. Still, they looked too close to the cabin for comfort. I tried not to let it get to me. I spent the day gathering more wood, walking a little down the path, and sitting on the porch with a book. The forest seemed less threatening in daylight, though the silence still pressed in. By afternoon, the fog lifted and sun cut through the trees, warming the air. I almost convinced myself the night before was just nerves. But when darkness came again, everything changed. The noises started earlier, while the last light was still slipping away. I heard branches snapping again, this time closer, a rustling that seemed to circle the clearing. I stayed inside with my lantern burning brighter than I needed. I kept my pack close and even set the hatchet I brought on the table within reach. Hours passed with no break in the sounds. Sometimes they faded only to return stronger. I avoided looking directly out the windows because I knew the lantern light would make it impossible to see far into the trees. All I would see was my own reflection in the glass and maybe movement I couldn't identify. Near midnight, I heard the porch creak again. This time, I knew it wasn't just wood shifting. The sound was slow, heavy, like weight pressing down on the old boards. Then it stopped. I sat perfectly still, staring at the door, every muscle tense. I expected a knock or the door handle to turn, but nothing came. After several minutes, the creaking sounded again, softer, moving away. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, I opened the door and checked the porch. There it was, clear as day. A footprint, not animal, not worn or smeared like before. A boot tread, pressed into the damp wood near the edge of the steps. I measured it against my own boot. It was larger, wider. Someone had been there. I felt a cold wave run through me. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had come onto the porch while I was inside. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me resisted. I told myself maybe it was just some hunter passing through, curious about the cabin, not meaning harm. Still, the fact they came so close at night without making themselves known didn't sit right. I stayed, though, telling myself I would give it one more night and then leave if anything else happened. That day dragged on endlessly. Couldn't relax. Every sound made me turn my head. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to wander too far and risk coming back to find someone waiting. I checked my supplies, packed them neatly, and kept my bag ready in case I had to leave quickly. As evening fell again, the unease grew heavier. The forest seemed too quiet, as if everything living out there had gone still. I kept the lantern low this time, thinking maybe it made me too visible before. I sat in the dark longer than I wanted, the faint glow barely pushing the shadows back. The noises came again later this time, not just branches snapping but slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I felt my chest tighten. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching. The steps stopped for long stretches, then started again, always moving, never rushing. At one point, I heard a scrape along the wall, like a hand brushing against the wood. I gripped the hatchet, sitting frozen in the chair, listening to my own breathing. Hours passed like that. When the first light of morning came, I stepped outside again. This time, the ground told me more than I wanted to know. Footprints circled the cabin in wide loops. Some stopped near the windows, others near the back door. Whoever it was, they had walked around the cabin over and over while I sat inside. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything quickly, loaded it into my bag, and decided I would leave as soon as possible. The problem was, the path back to town was long, and I didn't know if whoever had been circling the cabin was still nearby. I would have to pass through miles of forest before reaching safety. I waited until full daylight before I set off, moving quickly but trying not to make too much noise. The dirt road stretched ahead, narrow and uneven. Every snap of a branch behind me made me turn, scanning the trees. I never saw anyone, but the feeling of being watched never left me. By the time I reached my car parked at the end of the dirt road, I was sweating and my nerves were raw. The car was untouched. I unlocked it, threw my bag in, and started the engine. I drove fast, not slowing until I reached the main road. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see another vehicle behind me. There was nothing, just empty road. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I wouldn't. The memory of those footprints circling in the dirt and on the porch stayed with me. It was clear. Someone had been there. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months if I counted all the small decisions that went into it. It wasn't anything special in the sense of a big vacation or some luxury getaway, but it was something I had wanted for a long time. The idea of being alone, away from people, away from the constant hum of traffic, the glow of screens, and the noise of everything that came with living in a city, had been eating at me. I needed space, quiet, air that didn't smell of exhaust fumes, and nights that weren't washed in neon or the sound of neighbors shouting. The cabin had come up on a small rental listing, barely advertised, like one of those places people forgot about, and I knew as soon as I saw it that I wanted it. The place sat deep in a forested valley, not too far from a lake, but not close enough to be considered prime vacation land. It was a squat wooden structure, built decades ago, patched up here and there, but standing firm. It had one floor, two small rooms, and a porch that looked over a clearing. The man I rented it from didn't ask many questions. He just gave me a set of directions that were almost more like warnings. Watch for the fork in the dirt road. Don't miss it or you'll end up miles away. And make sure you fill up on gas before leaving town because there wasn't a station for nearly 40 miles. His instructions felt less like advice and more like a reminder that once I was out there, I'd really be on my own. That was the appeal though. I wanted isolation. I wanted to test myself in some way, see how I handled being away from everything I was used to. When I arrived, the air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The dirt road had been narrow, with branches scratching at the sides of my car, and by the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, I felt like I had driven into another world. The clearing around the cabin was quiet except for birds, the kind of quiet that made your ears almost buzz with the absence of human noise. I could hear my own heartbeat when I stepped out of the car. The cabin door stuck when I opened it, and the inside smelled of wood smoke and age, like it had absorbed decades of winters. There wasn't much inside, just a table, a couple of chairs, a narrow bed, a wood stove, and shelves stacked with canned food that looked like they had been there for years. The windows had heavy shutters you could pull closed from the inside, and I remember noticing how solid they felt, like they had been built to withstand storms. Or maybe something else. I settled in quickly, unpacking what little I brought. Some clothes, a flashlight, matches, a hatchet, a couple of knives, and enough food for a week. I had planned to hike during the day, read by lantern light at night, and spend the time clearing my head. That first day was calm, even pleasant. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, stretched my legs, listened to the wind moving through the trees. By nightfall, I was tired, but in a good way. I built a small fire outside, cooked a simple meal, and let myself get used to the idea of silence. The first strange thing I noticed was small. That night, after I went inside and shut the shutters, I thought I heard something faint, like a crack of a branch under weight. Not the kind of snap you get from wind, something heavier. I froze for a moment, standing by the table with the lantern throwing my shadow against the wall. My instinct told me it was probably a deer, maybe a bear if I was unlucky. I reminded myself that animals lived here, not me, and tried not to let the thought take hold. But even as I lay down on the bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of weight shifting through the trees, just beyond where I could see. The second day, I decided to hike a trail I had marked on a map before arriving. It led down toward the lake, winding through thick patches of forest. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air was cool in the shade. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had grown so used to the sound of people, of distant cars and constant city noise, that the silence of the forest pressed on me in a way I hadn't expected. It was beautiful, but it also left me with nothing to measure against. Every small sound, a squirrel scurrying, a bird taking flight, felt sharp and important. Halfway to the lake, I stopped to rest. That's when I saw it. A boot print. It was pressed into the soft ground near the side of the trail, angled slightly toward the woods. At first, I thought it might have been mine, but the size was different, larger, and the tread didn't match the boots I wore. I crouched and stared at it for a long time. The print wasn't fresh, but it wasn't washed out either. Someone had been here recently. I told myself it could have been a hunter or someone fishing at the lake, but something about it felt out of place. The trail wasn't marked, it wasn't even an official path. I had found it on an old map, half forgotten. I kept moving, but the thought sat heavy in my chest. By the time I reached the lake, I couldn't relax. I sat by the water for a while, watching it shift in the breeze, but the feeling of being watched crawled up the back of my neck. I left sooner than I planned and returned to the cabin before dark. That night, the noise came again. A snap of wood, then another. I sat on the bed, lantern turned low, listening so hard I thought my ears would split. It was close, closer than the night before. I gripped the hatchet I had left leaning by the bed. My heart was pounding, and every small creak of the cabins would sounded like it came from outside. After a long stretch of silence, I finally lay down again, though I didn't sleep much. On the third day, I didn't leave the clearing. I chopped wood, paced, checked my supplies. Every time I stepped out of the cabin, I felt exposed. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something. At one point, I walked around the clearing's edge again, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. A spot where the grass had been pressed down, like someone had stood there for a long time, faced the cabin. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't an animal that had been making those noises. Someone had been there, watching. I spent the rest of the day uneasy, waiting for the sun to go down. I closed the shutters early, double-checked the door, and kept the lantern low. As the night wore on, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not just random cracks, but slow, deliberate steps. They circled. One side of the cabin, then silence. Minutes later, another side. Whoever it was, they were testing me, testing the cabin. My grip on the hatchet tightened until my knuckles hurt. It went on for hours. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing just beyond the wall. Other times I thought I heard the scrape of something against the wood. I barely slept at all. By the fourth day, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving back to town. But part of me refused. I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was scaring myself. But deep down I knew. Someone was out there. That day I found more prints. Around the clearing, overlapping, some fresher than others. Whoever it was, they had been coming around more than once. My stomach turned when I realized they had probably been watching me since I first arrived. That night was the worst. The steps came back, bolder this time. They didn't just circle. They came right up to the walls. I heard the wood creak under pressure, as if someone leaned against it. Then a scrape, slow and long, like a hand dragging along the siding. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I stayed in the dark, clutching the hatchet, barely breathing. Hours passed like that, me frozen, listening. At one point, I heard the shutters rattle. Someone tried them. My skin went cold. I thought about making a run for the car, but the keys were by the door, and the thought of unlocking it while someone stood just outside froze me in place. When morning came, I found the marks. Scratches along the wood near the window. A footprint by the door. I felt sick. This wasn't random. Whoever it was, they wanted me scared. On the fifth day, I decided to leave. I packed my bag, grabbed what I could, and shoved everything back into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. I tried again and again, but nothing. The hood was still warm from the sun, but something was wrong. When I checked under the hood, I found the problem quickly. Wires had been cut. Clean, deliberate cuts. I remember standing there, staring at the damage, my hands shaking. Someone had been right next to my car, close enough to disable it, and I hadn't even noticed. Panic settled in then, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't leave, but I couldn't stay outside either. I went back into the cabin and barred the door. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark, waiting, listening. The footsteps came back, circling, slow and patient. I gripped the hatchet, every muscle locked. Hours passed, broken only by the sound of someone out there, reminding me I wasn't alone. By morning, I knew I had to act. I couldn't wait for them to come inside. I gathered my pack, took what little food I could carry, and left on foot. The road was long, and I didn't know how far I'd make it, but staying meant waiting for whoever was out there to decide what to do with me. I walked fast, never stopping, my ears straining at every sound in the woods. Branches snapped, I had been working long hours for months without much of a break. My head felt heavy every day. My body was tired, and I wanted nothing more than to be alone for a while somewhere quiet. A friend had once told me about an old cabin out by the edge of the woods, way off a dirt road that most people never used anymore. He had stayed there once and said it was silent, no neighbors around, no noise, and that it was the best place to rest if someone wanted time away. That thought stuck with me, and after a while I decided I needed it. I found the contact for the man who rented it out, arranged the days, packed up my truck, and left the city early one morning. The drive was longer than I expected. Once I left the highway, I was on cracked two-lane roads that twisted through farmland, and after another hour, even those gave way to a dirt path with weeds growing down the center. It was late afternoon by then. I noticed how my phone had already lost service, and I felt both nervous and relieved. Nervous because I was cut off from everything, but relieved because that was what I wanted. No calls, no messages, no interruptions. The dirt road stretched further and further into thick woods until I finally saw the cabin up ahead. The cabin looked old but solid. It was made of dark wood, the boards aged from years of rain and sun. A metal roof reflected the last bit of daylight. There was a small porch with two wooden steps, one of them crooked, and a door with peeling paint. The windows were single pane, and the glass had a slight ripple, the kind that showed its age. Around the cabin, the woods pressed close, tall trees standing in rows like walls. There was no fence, no other building, nothing but trees and dirt. The air smelled heavy with pine, damp leaves, and earth. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was one main room with a wooden table, two chairs, and a small counter with a sink that had a hand pump. Against one wall was a fireplace with soot built up around the edges. A short hallway led to a single bedroom with a bed frame made of rough wood and a mattress that looked older than me. There was one closet with a broken door that didn't shut all the way. The floor creaked when I walked across it, and I could hear the sound echo faintly in the empty space. Dust hung in the air when I opened the windows, and I could feel how still everything was. The first night was quiet. I unpacked some food I had brought, cans, bread, and bottled water. I lit a lantern and sat at the table, listening to the sounds outside. The forest wasn't silent, but it was different from the city. I could hear insects, the faint call of an owl, and the rustle of branches moving in the wind. Every so often I thought I heard something heavier, like the crunch of a footstep on leaves, but I told myself it was just animals moving around in the woods. I didn't stay awake long. After a small meal, I lay down on the bed. The mattress sagged under my weight, the springs creaking, but it was good enough. I drifted off to sleep with the faint smell of old wood around me. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight came through the thin curtains and lit up the room in stripes. I went outside and felt the cold air. The forest looked different in daylight, less closed in, but it was still dense. The dirt road was barely visible from the porch. It seemed to almost disappear behind the trees. I spent most of the morning walking around, stretching my legs, exploring the immediate area. The cabin sat on a small clearing, but just a few steps in any direction, the trees closed in again. The ground was covered in pine needles, broken branches, and damp leaves. I found a stream about 200 yards away. The water was shallow but clear. I filled a bottle and washed my hands in it. The cold made my fingers ache. I marked the spot in my mind so I could come back when I needed more water. The day passed slowly, and I liked it that way. I read a book I had brought, ate some food, and sat on the porch for a long time watching the sun sink lower behind the trees. When night came again, I lit the lantern, ate some bread, and went to bed early. But this time, sleep didn't come so easily. I kept hearing noises outside. First, it was just rustling like before. Then it was footsteps, or at least it sounded like footsteps. The sound came in a pattern, stop and go, like someone moving slowly through the leaves. I lay still, listening. Every time I thought it was gone, it would come back, faint but clear. Something about it didn't feel like an animal. Animals usually moved quickly, but this was slow, steady. My chest tightened as I listened. I told myself again and again it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, I drifted off, but it was restless, shallow sleep. The following morning, I went outside to look around. The dirt around the cabin was soft from rain a few days earlier, and I noticed prints. Not animal prints, shoe prints. They were faint, but they circled near the porch and went off toward the woods. I froze when I saw them. They weren't mine. I had only been wearing boots with a heavy tread, and these were flatter, narrower, like sneakers. I crouched down and studied them, feeling my stomach twist. Someone had been close to the cabin during the night. I stood there for a long time, listening to the trees, trying to hear if anyone was around. Nothing moved. No voices, no sound of an engine, nothing. The prints disappeared into the thick brush, and I couldn't follow them without making a lot of noise myself. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table, thinking. The place was supposed to be empty, no one around for miles. The man who rented it out had said so himself. But someone had been here. Someone had walked right up near the porch while I was inside. That whole day I felt uneasy. Every creak of the wood, every sound outside, made me tense. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't focus. I thought about leaving, but the drive back was long, and it would be dark before I reached the main road. So I stayed. I decided I would keep the lantern low that night so it didn't shine out through the windows. I closed the curtains tightly. I sat on the bed in silence, listening. The sounds came again, rustling, then pauses, then faint steps closer this time. I sat up, every muscle tight. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, crunching on the leaves, then stopping. At one point, I swore I heard the porch steps creak, but when I strained to listen, it went quiet again. Minutes passed like hours. I barely breathed. I stayed like that until the noises faded. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off sitting up. When I woke, it was daylight, and my body was stiff from not moving. I forced myself to go outside again. This time, the prints were clearer. Someone had definitely been walking around. They went around the whole cabin, stopping at the windows, then back to the porch, then disappearing into the woods. I could even see where someone had stood near the side wall for a long time. The dirt pressed deeper. Fear burned in my stomach. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to get in, but they were watching, waiting. I wanted to leave, but I kept thinking about how far I had to drive on the dirt road, how easy it would be for someone to follow me, maybe even force me off the road where no one would see. Out here, no one would hear anything. That thought made me feel trapped. I stayed another night, but I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the table with the lantern off, knife from the kitchen in my hand, staring at the door. I heard the sounds again, this time closer than before. Soft steps, slow breathing outside one of the windows, the porch creaking. I sat there frozen, gripping the knife so tight my hand hurt. The noises stopped just before dawn. When the sun rose, I looked outside and saw fresh prints again, circling tighter around the cabin, as if whoever it was had been working up courage. That was enough. I packed up my things quickly, heart racing. I loaded the truck, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road. Every bump in the road felt like it slowed me down, and I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting to see someone step out from the trees or a car following behind. But the road stayed empty. After what felt like forever, I reached the main road. I didn't stop until I was back near town, surrounded by other cars, cell service back on my phone. I never found out who it was. Maybe just someone passing through, maybe someone who used the cabin when it was empty, maybe worse. All I know is that for 3 nights, someone circled that cabin, close enough to touch the walls while I sat inside, thinking I was alone. I never went back. I went up to the cabin that weekend because I wanted to be away from people. The cabin sat in the woods about 2 miles from the main road, down a dirt path that twisted between thick trees and brush. The air was cool, and the sky was already turning gray when I arrived. The whole place looked quiet, almost too quiet, like the woods had pressed in close and decided not to let much sound through. I parked the truck in the clearing, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment. I could hear the clicking sound of the engine cooling off, and beyond that, nothing but faint rustling in the trees when the wind caught the leaves. I carried my things inside and checked over the cabin. It was small, 1 room with a loft bed above, a little kitchen counter, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. The walls were old pine boards, darkened with age. The air inside smelled of wood, dust, and faint smoke from the last fire someone had burned. I set my bag on the table and walked around to get used to the place again. I had been here before, but never alone. The first hours were fine. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled a pot with water I had brought, and lit a small fire to warm the place. As the fire crackled, I noticed how much the silence outside pressed against the walls. There were no distant cars, no voices, no signs of people anywhere. Just trees, rocks, and the cabin itself. It was the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. A branch snapping outside made me look up. The stove popping from the heat made me twitch. By the time night came, I had eaten and sat in the chair by the stove, watching the flames. Darkness outside the windows was complete. There were no lights, no glow, not even stars because of the heavy clouds. The only light was from the stove, and it flickered across the wooden walls and floor. I tried to read, but I kept putting the book down because I thought I heard something outside. It was always faint, like a footstep too far away to be sure, or something brushing against the wood of the cabin. But each time I froze and listened. Nothing followed, so I tried to relax again. When I finally climbed into the loft bed, I felt uneasy. The window above the bed showed nothing but blackness. I left the fire burning low, but it threw only a weak glow into the loft. I lay there listening. The cabin creaked sometimes as the wood shifted with the heat. The wind moved branches against the roof. But underneath those things, I thought I could hear something slower, something like movement outside, circling the cabin. I stayed awake a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, until I eventually drifted into sleep. I woke in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. Then I realized the fire was almost out, and the cabin was very dark. I stayed still, listening. I heard it again, something outside, close, moving. It wasn't the wind this time. The sound was steady, like steps on the ground. I lay there without breathing, trying to hear clearly. The steps were slow, crunching leaves, circling around. My chest felt tight. I didn't move. After a while, the sound faded. I waited longer before I let myself close my eyes again. The next morning, I went outside as soon as the sun was up. The air was cold, and the ground was damp. I walked around the cabin, looking. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed the dirt by the side of the cabin. There were marks, not clear footprints, but scuffed areas like someone had walked back and forth there. They were fresh, pressed into the wet ground. I knelt down and stared at them. They weren't from an animal. They were from boots. Someone had been outside the cabin at night, close, walking circles. My stomach turned, and I felt my whole body tighten. I stood up and looked at the woods. The trees were thick, shadows between them even in daylight. Anything could be in there, standing still, watching. I backed toward the cabin door and went inside, locking it. I sat at the table and thought. My truck was still outside, untouched. Nothing had been broken into, but someone had been out there, and I had no idea if they were still nearby. I spent the day unsettled. Every sound outside made me stiffen. I walked to the edge of the clearing several times, looking into the trees. Once I thought I saw movement far back, just a shift of something between two tree trunks, but when I stared, there was nothing. I told myself it was probably just the wind moving branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the day wore on, clouds thickened again. The light faded early, and by the time I had the fire going and dinner cooked, the woods outside were nearly black again. I forced myself to eat, but every bite was heavy. When I cleaned up, I kept checking the window. I thought of leaving, but the road out was rough and narrow, and I didn't want to drive it in the dark. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't go up to the loft. I dragged the mattress down in front of the stove, close to the door, where I could listen better. I kept the fire higher, so there was more light, though it threw heavy shadows around the room. I lay down with my coat still on, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the crack of the fire. It didn't take long. Maybe an hour after I tried to close my eyes, I heard it again. Steps outside, moving slowly around the cabin. They paused sometimes, then started again. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door. The fire popped, but under it I heard clear crunching in the leaves. Whoever it was, they were close, circling again and again. I stayed frozen, my ears straining. At one point, the sound stopped right at the wall behind me. I held my breath. The wood of the wall creaked, like someone leaned against it. I gripped the blanket tight, waiting. Then the steps started again, moving around to the other side. I didn't sleep at all. The steps went on for hours, sometimes fading, sometimes coming close. Only toward morning did they finally disappear. I sat up against the wall until light came. When I finally opened the door, I saw more scuffed prints in the dirt, clearer this time. They circled the cabin many times. Some came right up to the windows. I looked at the trees and felt like my chest had closed up. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were watching the cabin, watching me. I rushed inside, packed my bag, and loaded the truck. My hands shook as I locked the cabin behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder at the woods as I carried things out. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. When I finally started the truck and pulled down the dirt path, I felt a small release in my chest. The road was rough, and branches scraped the sides as I drove faster than I should have. Every curve made me grip the wheel harder. I didn't slow down until I saw the paved road ahead. Only then did I stop, get out, and breathe. I looked back once at the narrow path into the trees. Nothing was there, just the dark tunnel of branches. I never went back to that cabin again. The memory of those nights, the steady footsteps circling, the marks in the dirt, the silence pressing in, stayed with me. It wasn't ghosts or anything made up. It was someone real, someone who knew I was alone out there and decided to come close in the night. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I only know I left before I found out the hard way. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea of being away from the noise of the city and the constant rush of people had been the main reason I had rented the cabin. I wanted silence, I wanted isolation, and I wanted to spend a few days with nothing but trees, water, and my own thoughts. The place I found online seemed perfect. The pictures showed an old wooden cabin tucked deep in the woods, sitting on the edge of a small lake. The nearest road was a few miles away, and there were no other houses nearby. The owner had told me in his email that people rarely went that far out, and cell service was weak to non-existent. That had been fine with me. In fact, it was exactly what I wanted. The drive out there had been long. I had left early in the morning, but by the time I got to the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dropping lower in the sky. The last stretch was rough. The road was full of rocks and holes, and I had to go slow to avoid damaging the car. Branches scraped the sides as I drove, and I kept glancing around, noticing how thick the forest had grown. The further I went, the more it felt like the world outside was falling away. It was just me, the car, and the woods. I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, and I remember the way my chest eased when I cut the engine. There was silence, heavy and complete. No cars, no voices, no buzzing phones. Just the faint sound of the wind through the trees and the ripple of water from the lake beyond the cabin. The cabin itself looked even more worn down in person than it had in the photos. The wood was gray and weathered, with dark patches where water had stained it. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. The windows were dusty, and one of the shutters hung loosely, as if it hadn't been fixed in years. But I didn't mind. I had expected rustic. I wasn't there for luxury. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. There was a small kitchen area, a main room with a fireplace, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. Simple, functional, and exactly what I had wanted. I unpacked my bags, set up some food in the kitchen, and went outside to look at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the trees on the opposite shore. It looked deep and dark, the kind of water that didn't let you see what was underneath. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the air, listening to the soft lap of water against the shore. The world felt far away, and I felt a kind of peace that I hadn't felt in years. But that peace wouldn't last. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, sat in the main room with a lantern, and read a book until I got tired. There was no electricity, just a couple of gas lamps and the fireplace. It got cold quickly once the sun went down, so I built a fire. The crackle and warmth filled the room, and for a moment, it felt cozy. I went to bed early, wrapped in a heavy blanket, listening to the sound of the wind outside. I fell asleep quickly, and nothing disturbed me. The second day was when things started to feel different. I woke up early, went outside, and walked along the edge of the lake. The air was cool and damp, and I could see my breath in front of me. I decided to explore the woods a little. I followed a small path that led away from the cabin, deeper into the trees. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. After about half an hour, I realized how easy it would be to get lost if I went too far. The trees all looked the same, and there were no landmarks. I turned back and returned to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept up on me while I was out there. Later that afternoon, I noticed something strange. On the far side of the lake, just barely visible through the trees, there was something that looked like a path leading into the woods. I hadn't seen it the day before. It was narrow, overgrown, but definitely there. For a while, I just stared at it from the porch, wondering where it led. I told myself it was probably nothing, just an old trail from when people used to come out here more often. Still, I felt drawn to it. I didn't go that day. Instead, I spent the evening chopping some wood, fixing up the fire, and trying to relax. But as the sun set, the woods seemed to close in around the cabin. The sound of the wind grew louder, and every crack of a branch outside made me lift my head. I told myself it was just animals. There were plenty of deer out here, maybe raccoons, maybe even bears. Nothing unusual. But that didn't stop the unease from settling deeper into me. That night, I slept lighter. I woke several times to the sound of something moving outside, faint but close. Each time, I held still in bed, straining my ears. The footsteps, or whatever they were, never lasted long. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. On the third day, I finally decided to check out the path. I waited until the afternoon, when the sun was still high and the woods didn't feel as threatening. I walked around the lake, the ground uneven and damp, until I reached the spot. Up close, the trail looked even less used than I had thought. Branches hung low across it, and weeds had grown thick. I stepped onto it and began to follow it into the trees. The path wound deeper and deeper, twisting and narrowing as it went. I kept glancing behind me, making sure I could still see the lake through the trees. After a while, the lake disappeared completely, and it was just the woods. The silence was heavier here, almost pressing against me. I don't know how far I went, but eventually, I saw something up ahead through the trees. At first, I thought it was another cabin. As I got closer, I realized it was more like the remains of one. It was old, falling apart, half swallowed by the forest. The roof had caved in and the walls were leaning. Moss and vines covered most of it, and the windows were broken. I stood there for a long time just staring. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. Like the forest itself had tried to erase this place and failed. I didn't go inside. I couldn't bring myself to. I circled it from a distance, and that's when I noticed something else. There were signs of old campsites nearby. Fire pits filled with ash, rusted cans, broken bottles. Some looked decades old, but others didn't. Some looked more recent. My stomach tightened when I saw a blanket half buried under leaves, still bright in color, not yet faded. Someone had been here not too long ago. I turned around and walked back, faster this time, my heart pounding. Every crack of a twig behind me made me spin around, but I saw nothing. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. When I finally broke out of the trees and saw the water again, I felt relief so sharp it almost hurt. I hurried back inside, shut the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I stood there, listening to the silence. That night, the noises outside were worse, more distinct. I heard definite footsteps moving around the cabin. Not the quick, darting sound of animals, but slow, steady steps. They circled, pausing now and then continued. I sat in the main room with the fire out, barely breathing. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but it was too quick to be sure. I stayed awake until dawn, every nerve on edge, my body stiff with fear. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay the whole trip. Something was wrong here. I didn't know what, but I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag and carried it to the car. But when I turned the key, the engine only clicked. I tried again, harder this time, but it wouldn't start. Panic rose in me as I tried over and over, but the car was dead. I lifted the hood, though I knew almost nothing about engines. That's when I saw the cut wires. Clean cuts. Someone had done it on purpose. My throat tightened, and my vision blurred for a moment. I stumbled back from the car, looking around the trees, feeling exposed. Whoever had been outside at night had done this. They didn't want me to leave. I spent the day inside the cabin, sitting with my back against the wall, listening. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking about the old cabin, the campsites, the blanket. I wondered if others had stayed here before me, if they had gone down that path and not come back. As the sun set, dread filled me. I knew the night was coming, and I had no way out. The noises began again after dark. Footsteps, closer this time. I heard something scrape against the porch. I held the fireplace poker in my hands, gripping it until my knuckles hurt. Hours passed like that, until I finally heard the sound of the front door handle moving. Slowly, carefully, it turned. My breath caught, and I pressed myself against the wall. The lock held, but the handle rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. Minutes dragged by, and then the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. I sat there until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows. As soon as it was light enough, I grabbed my bag and left the cabin. I didn't take the car. I went on foot back down the rough dirt road. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just walked as fast as I could. The woods felt alive around me, watching. I remember the first time I pulled up to the cabin. The road was narrow and mostly made of gravel, twisting between tall pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. My car rattled over loose rocks, and the forest pressed close on both sides, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel of green. I had rented the place online weeks earlier, looking for a quiet escape to get away from the noise of the city. At the time, I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would be good for me to spend a week in the woods, with nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional bird calling out in the distance. I had no idea how different it would really feel once I was there, alone, with no one around for miles. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin standing by itself, surrounded by trees so thick I could not see more than a few feet past the clearing's edge. The building looked old but solid, made of dark wood that had weathered from years of rain and snow. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows looked almost too small for the size of the place. There was a porch in front with 2 steps leading up to it. My tires crunched on the gravel as I parked near the porch. The sound of my engine shutting off left me in silence so heavy that I could hear my own heartbeat. The air felt different there. It was cooler and sharper, almost damp, like the forest carried its own kind of chill even in the middle of summer. I got out of the car and stretched my legs, taking in the place. I could smell pine and earth, strong and almost overwhelming. The forest around me didn't move much. The trees stood still, tall and heavy, and the shadows they threw across the clearing made the daylight seem dim. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, like no one had lived there for months. The floor creaked under my boots. The cabin had a single large room with a stone fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area in the corner, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture was simple. An old wooden table, 2 chairs, and a couch that looked worn but clean. The place was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. First, I felt calm. I unpacked my bags, put away food in the kitchen, and set my things in the bedroom. The idea was to spend the week hiking, reading, and just being away from people. The internet at the cabin was weak and patchy, which I had known before I came, but I thought that was fine. I told myself I wanted the quiet. I wanted the break. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire in the fireplace, cooked myself a simple meal, and sat by the light of a lamp while I read. Outside, the forest grew darker and darker until the windows were nothing but black squares. I tried not to think about how isolated I was, but it sat heavy in the back of my mind. When I finally went to bed, the silence pressed down on me so thick it felt like a weight. In the city, there is always noise, cars in the distance, people talking, sirens. Out here, there was nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the sound of the trees brushing against each other in the wind. By the second day, I started to notice the small things that made the cabin feel less comfortable. The back door didn't lock very well. It had a latch, but when I tested it, the wood around it seemed weak. I could feel the door shift if I pressed on it too hard. The windows also had simple locks, nothing strong, just little clips that held them shut. I told myself it was fine, that no one was out there anyway, but the thought of how easy it would be for someone to push their way inside stayed with me. That night, after I turned out the lights and lay down, I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like a branch snapping or a footstep on the gravel near the porch. I froze in bed, my ears straining. For a long time, I heard nothing, and eventually I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. Still, my heart beat faster, and I found it hard to fall asleep again. On the third day, I decided to hike along one of the trails near the cabin. The air was cool, and the forest felt both beautiful and oppressive. The trees were so tall they blocked most of the sky, and the ground was uneven with roots and rocks. After about an hour of walking, I came across something odd. A piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt or a jacket torn off. It was dirty and faded, but it didn't look very old. I stood there staring at it, wondering who it had belonged to. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived, not even another car on the road. I took the fabric off the branch and held it for a while, then dropped it and kept walking, but the image of it stuck with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in those woods. When I cooked my dinner, I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. When I stepped outside to get more firewood, I felt like eyes were on me, though the clearing was still and empty. I locked the doors as best I could, checking them twice before bed. I had almost fallen asleep when I heard it again. A sound outside. This time it was clearer. Gravel shifting, as though someone was walking slowly near the porch. My chest tightened, and I sat up in bed. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, crunching softly on the ground, and then I heard the porch step creak. I stayed frozen in bed, my body tense. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Maybe an animal, maybe just the wood settling. But the sound of weight on the porch was too clear. I waited for the knock on the door, or for the handle to turn, but nothing happened. After a long, terrifying stretch of silence, I heard the steps again, this time moving away. The gravel crunched softly, then faded. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small noise made me sit up and listen, my ears straining in the dark. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted. I walked outside in the morning, looking for footprints, but the ground was too hard and covered in pine needles to see much. I did notice, though, that one of the chairs on the porch had been moved. It was subtle, just a few inches from where I remembered it, but I knew I hadn't touched it. The days that followed blurred together. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the sounds were just animals and my mind was making the rest up. But small things kept happening that I couldn't explain. I found the back door slightly open one morning when I was sure I had latched it. I found a cigarette but near the edge of the clearing, though I didn't smoke. One night, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall of the cabin, like fingers dragging across wood. I started keeping a kitchen knife near me at all times. At night, I placed it on the table beside the couch or the bed, within reach. I double-checked the locks, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and pulled the curtains shut. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt dangerous. Every creak, every gust of wind against the walls made my chest tighten. On the fifth night, things escalated. I woke to a noise outside, louder this time, more deliberate, gravel crunching, slow and heavy. My pulse raced, and I sat up in bed, clutching the knife. I heard the porch step groan again, Then the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. The latch rattled softly, once, twice, then stopped. My body shook as I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it never did. After a while, the steps retreated, fading into silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting at the table with the knife in my hand, staring at the door. When daylight finally came, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I knew now without question that someone was out there. Someone had been watching the cabin, circling it at night, testing the doors. I wanted to leave, but the thought of driving that long gravel road through the woods with someone possibly following me made my stomach turn. I had no cell signal strong enough to call anyone. The internet was too weak to send a message. I was stuck, at least until morning when I could gather everything and leave in daylight. That night, the final night, was the worst. I tried to stay awake, sitting by the table with my knife, staring at the door. For hours, nothing happened. My eyes grew heavy, and my head dropped forward a few times as I fought off sleep. Then I heard it, the sound of glass breaking. I jumped to my feet, heart hammering. The sound had come from the kitchen window. I could hear feet crunching on glass as someone climbed inside. My whole body froze, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then I backed toward the hallway, gripping the knife so tight my hand hurt. I could hear the person moving slowly, stepping carefully across the floor. The sound was steady, patient. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no escape except through the bedroom window, which was small and half-stuck. I turned toward it anyway, forcing it open with all my strength. The wood groaned, but it gave enough for me to squeeze through. I scrambled out into the night, landing hard on the ground. My knees hit dirt, and I stumbled before pulling myself up and running into the trees. Branches slapped my arms and face as I forced my way deeper into the forest. Behind me, I thought I heard the porch creak, but I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months. I wanted time alone, far away from the constant noise of the city, the deadlines, the phone that never stopped buzzing, and the people who always seemed to need something. I wanted silence, stillness, and the kind of quiet where you could hear your own breathing. A friend of mine told me about an old cabin he had stayed at once, years ago, hidden deep in the woods about 3 hours from the nearest town. He said it was basic, no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a hand pump outside, and 4 walls to keep the wind off you. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. After leaving the highway, the road became a rough dirt track, weaving through endless trees. The forest looked endless, dark green stretching on both sides, tall trunks blocking any wider view. I hadn't seen another car since leaving town. After a while, the road narrowed so much that branches scraped the sides of my truck. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked even more isolated than I imagined. It sat in a small clearing, the grass high and wild around it. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, dark with years of weather. The wood siding was gray and dry, nails rusting, but still holding together. The windows were small, with wooden shutters pulled closed on the outside. A stone chimney leaned up one side of the cabin, black stains down the stones from smoke. To the right was an old water pump, rusted and squeaking when I tested it. A few yards past that, the tree line thickened again, the forest waiting quietly. I unloaded my gear. A cooler of food, a sleeping bag, a lantern, matches, a small camping stove, a hatchet, and a duffel of clothes. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was one room with a cot in the corner, a small wooden table, and a couple of chairs. The stove sat against the wall near the chimney, with a small pile of old wood stacked beside it. The air was stale, but it felt solid, safe enough for a week. The first day was simple. I unpacked, swept out cobwebs, and opened the shutters to let light inside. The forest outside was thick, pressing in on all sides, but quiet. I walked a bit into the trees before dark, just to get a feel for the place. The ground was soft with old leaves and moss. Every sound seemed to carry: the crunch of my boots, the distant creak of branches, the occasional call of a bird. I didn't go too far. I didn't want to lose sight of the cabin. That night, the silence felt different than I expected. I thought it would be peaceful, but it was heavy. I lay in my sleeping bag on the cot, lantern out, only the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the shutters. I could hear the forest breathing, branches moving, the faint sound of something small moving through the leaves outside. Every time the wood creaked, it made my body stiffen. It wasn't city noise. There was no traffic, no voices, no hum of appliances. This was deeper. Every sound felt close. The second day, I settled in. I chopped some wood, walked to a nearby stream I had seen on the map, and filled a container with water. I cooked simple meals on the small stove and spent hours just sitting on the porch, staring at the trees. It felt like I was the only person alive. By evening, the air was cold, and I built a fire in the stove. The sound of the crackling wood was comforting, but when the fire died down, the silence returned even heavier. On the third night, I woke suddenly, not sure why. The moon was bright through the shutters, casting pale light across the wooden floor. I listened and heard it again. Something outside. At first it sounded like an animal moving, branches snapping, leaves shifting. But then it stopped. Then, very faintly, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps in the grass. I held my breath. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, soft but steady. My skin prickled. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a bear, but the steps sounded too careful. I sat up slowly, trying not to make the cot squeak. The stove had gone out and the room was cold. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The steps stopped, and the night returned to silence. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The grass was high, but I thought I saw where it had been pressed down near the side, as if something heavy had passed through. No clear footprints, but the ground was disturbed. I convinced myself it was just an animal, though the thought of someone walking out here, in the middle of nowhere, made me uneasy. That day, I tried to distract myself. I hiked farther into the woods, found a ridge with a view of endless trees stretching to the horizon. There was no sign of people anywhere. No trails, no cabins, no smoke. Just forest. I stayed out until the sun started to sink, then hurried back before dark. That night, I made sure the shutters were closed tight. I sat by the stove longer than usual, keeping the fire high. When I finally lay down, I listened hard, every muscle tense. Hours passed in silence. Just as I started to drift, I heard it again. Slow steps in the grass, circling. My throat tightened. I didn't move. The steps came closer to the wall, then stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. For what felt like an hour, nothing moved. Finally, the sound faded away. In the morning, I checked again. More grass pressed down, this time closer to the cabin walls. I thought about leaving, but the truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, and the idea of packing up in the dark and driving 3 hours back down that narrow road felt worse. I told myself again it was just an animal. Maybe elk, maybe something else. I tried to believe it, but each night it returned. The sounds always started the same. Branches snapping, the soft rustle of grass, then slow, careful steps. Some nights it circled. Some nights it stopped just outside the wall where I lay. Once I thought I heard the faintest scrape, like a hand brushing wood. My stomach knotted each time, my body frozen. I never moved. On the 5th morning, I found something different. In the soft dirt near the water pump, there was a footprint. Human, bare. The heel was deep, toes spread in the mud. I stared at it for a long time, my mouth dry. It wasn't mine. I had been wearing boots the entire time. The rest of the day, I couldn't think straight. Every sound in the forest made me turn my head. I stayed close to the cabin, axe in hand, checking the tree line over and over. I didn't eat much. My hands shook whenever I poured water. By evening, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed most of my gear, stuffed my sleeping bag, and kept everything near the door. That night, I barely breathed. I sat with the axe in my lap, lantern low, eyes fixed on the door. When the sounds came, I was ready. The steps were slower this time, heavier. They came right up to the porch. The boards creaked under weight. I gripped the handle of the axe so hard my hand cramped. Then, for the first time, the door handle rattled. The blood drained from my face. Someone was outside. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The handle moved again, slow, like someone testing it. Then it stopped. Silence again. After a long time, the steps moved away, fading into the night. At dawn, I threw everything into the truck and drove. My chest hurt from the pounding of my heart. The dirt road felt endless, every shadow in the trees making me think of someone watching. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and sat for hours, trying to shake the image of that bare footprint. I kept telling myself it could have been some drifter, some hunter, some lost hiker. But I knew how far out that cabin was. There were no trails, no camps, nothing for miles. Whoever it was, they hadn't been lost. They had been watching, and they hadn't wanted me to leave. Even now, when I close my eyes, I still hear the slow steps in the grass circling in the dark, patient, waiting. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The cabin was supposed to be a break from everything I had been dealing with back in the city. I wanted silence, open space, and no interruptions. The place was tucked away deep in the woods, far off the main road, and I had picked it on purpose because it was supposed to be isolated. I liked the thought of no neighbors, no cars passing, no one around to bother me. Just trees, the sound of wind through the branches, and maybe the smell of wood smoke at night when I lit a fire in the stove. That was what I imagined when I booked it. The drive out there was long and tiring. The paved road turned into gravel, and then the gravel ended at a dirt trail. I kept thinking I had gone too far, but the directions I had printed out told me to keep going. I followed the track until it narrowed into something that barely looked like a road anymore. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and there were dips in the ground where water must have run during storms. I kept going until I finally saw the roof of the cabin between the trees. It looked small, dark against the green around it, with the late afternoon sun hitting the top of the pines behind it. I parked a little way from the front porch and sat for a while in the truck, listening. There was no noise except for the sound of insects and a bird calling somewhere far off. No traffic, no voices, nothing. It was exactly what I had wanted. When I stepped out, I noticed how quiet it really was. The trees seemed to close in all around the clearing, and the cabin sat there with its roof covered in moss and the porch sagging a little. The air smelled like damp soil and old leaves. It had the feel of a place that hadn't been touched much in years. I carried my things inside. The door was stiff when I pushed it open, and the smell of old would hit me right away. Inside, the cabin was simple. Just one large room with a small kitchen area, a bed against the wall, and a wood stove. Dust lay on the shelves, and the window glass was streaked and cloudy. There were a few old chairs, a table, and not much else. It wasn't fancy, but I didn't need fancy. I wanted peace. That first evening was calm. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the porch until the sun dipped down behind the trees, and then went inside when the air started to cool. When darkness came, it came hard. Out there were no streetlights, no glow from nearby houses. Once the sun went down, the woods were swallowed in black. I turned on the old lantern I had brought and set it on the table, the small circle of light not reaching far. It felt strange to know that outside those walls, there was only endless dark forest. The first night I slept well. I was tired from the drive and from unloading everything. The bed creaked, but it held me fine. When I woke up, it was already bright outside, and the quietness felt comforting. The days that followed were slow. I hiked around the area, cooked simple meals, wrote in a notebook I had brought, and sat by the creek a little way from the cabin. I didn't see another person anywhere. No one passed by on foot or in a car. I didn't hear gunshots or engines or even distant voices. I thought maybe no one lived within miles of me. That thought was a little strange at first, but then I grew used to it. It was on the third night that I noticed something that unsettled me. I had been outside late, sitting on the porch watching the stars. I stayed out until I could feel the chill in my arms, and then I went in, shutting the door tight. I had just settled into bed when I heard a sound outside. At first I thought it was just an animal. It was a steady, crunching sound, like footsteps on leaves. I held still, listening. The sound stopped. Then, after a moment, I heard it again, closer this time, moving slowly. My heart beat harder. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavy, not like a small animal scurrying, but like a person walking carefully. The hair on my arms stood up, and I lay still, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The steps came closer, then stopped again. Silence pressed in on me. After a long while, I heard nothing more. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but eventually sleep dragged me under. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was covered with leaves and pine needles, not soil soft enough to hold clear tracks. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself again it must have been an animal. That evening, though, I made sure to lock the door and push a chair under the handle, just in case. The next night, the sound came again. I had fallen asleep, but something woke me. I lay still, my ears straining. The same crunching sound came from outside, slow and deliberate. This time, it circled the cabin. I followed it with my ears as it moved from one side to the back, then to the other side. I lay frozen, every muscle tight, hardly daring to breathe. I stopped near the window. I didn't move. The thought that someone was out there, standing just feet from me while I lay inside, filled me with a kind of fear I had never known before. After a long while, the sound faded, the steps moving back into the woods. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I went outside again and looked carefully. This time, I noticed something. By the window, in the layer of pine needles, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had been standing there. The pine needles were crushed down in a way that looked too large and deliberate to be from an animal. The fear settled heavier in me then. It wasn't just in my head. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked around the cabin in the dark while I was inside. I started thinking about who it could be. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living nearby, maybe just someone passing through. But why would they walk around the cabin at night? Why not just knock or make themselves known if they were lost? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. That day, I considered leaving. I packed some of my things back into the truck, but then I told myself I might be overreacting. Maybe it really was just an animal, or maybe I was imagining more than what was really there. I decided to stay another night, but I kept the chair braced under the door and stayed awake as long as I could. That night, the sound came again, but different this time. Instead of just walking, whoever it was began trying the door. The handle rattled slightly, then stopped, then rattled again. The chair held firm, but my heart slammed in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I had brought and sat up in bed, gripping it tight. I thought about shining it out the window, but stopped myself. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The rattling stopped. Then there was silence. After a long while, I heard the steps moving away again into the trees. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes and food into bags. I kept looking at the window, expecting to see a face there. When I carried the last bag to the truck, I caught sight of something on the porch that made me stop cold. There was a footprint in the dirt just off the bottom step. It was the clear shape of a boot, not mine. That was all I needed. I started the truck and drove, bouncing down the dirt road as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to see it again. It took hours to reach the main road, and when I finally did, the sight of a car passing felt like a relief I couldn't put into words. I didn't stop until I was well out of the woods and back in town. When I got to a gas station, I sat in the truck for a long time, just breathing, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I kept thinking about those footsteps circling the cabin, the sound of the handle rattling, the print in the dirt. Someone had been out there watching me in the dark. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I drove up to the mountains in late October, when the air had already grown cold enough to sting my face and the trees had shed most of their leaves. The road to the cabin was rough and narrow, winding between steep hillsides where loose rock often slid onto the path. I had rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be good to get away from everything for a while. I wanted silence, the kind of silence where you could hear your own breathing. The idea was to spend time alone, away from phones, away from the noise of town, away from anyone at all. The cabin itself sat deep in the woods, about a 20-minute drive off the last paved road. It was old but sturdy, with weathered wooden boards, a green tin roof, and a stone chimney that leaned slightly. Inside, it smelled of pine and dust. There was one main room with a small kitchen tucked to the side, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture was plain, just a table, 2 chairs, and an old couch with thin cushions. The windows were single-paned glass, and I could already feel cold drafts slipping in. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the place. I stacked the groceries in the small fridge, carried my bag to the bedroom, and checked the woodpile outside. There was enough to last about 3 days if I burned it sparingly. I made a mental note to gather more before the weather turned worse. First, everything felt calm. The stillness was heavier than what I was used to, but I told myself that was why I came. At night, the forest pressed in tight around the cabin, and the darkness outside the windows felt like it had weight to it. I noticed how quickly my ears picked up small sounds, the shifting of the roof in the wind, the tick of cooling metal, the occasional crack of branches somewhere outside. I tried not to think about it too much, but I found myself listening carefully, almost waiting for something to happen. The first 2 days passed quietly. I took long walks through the woods, following faint trails made by deer. The air was damp and cool, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. I carried a small backpack with water, a knife, and a flashlight just in case. Most of the time, I saw no one and nothing but trees stretching endlessly around me. Once in a while, I spotted movement. A squirrel darting up a trunk, a crow lifting from a branch, but nothing larger. On the third night, things began to feel different. I woke up around 2 in the morning, not sure why. The cabin was quiet except for the faint hum of wind against the walls. I lay there for a few minutes trying to fall back asleep when I heard it, a sound from outside. It was faint but clear, a crunching, like footsteps pressing down on dry leaves. They came slowly, one after another, then stopped. I held my breath. My first thought was that it had to be an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe something larger. But the way the steps paused, then shifted again, felt deliberate, like someone moving carefully. I sat up in bed and listened harder. The steps seemed to circle the cabin, slow and steady, stopping for long moments. I felt my chest tighten. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but I didn't turn it on yet. The thought of shining light through the window and actually seeing someone out there made my skin crawl. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. After a while, the steps faded into the distance. I sat there for a long time, gripping the flashlight before I finally lay back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was soft from fallen leaves, and I couldn't see any clear tracks. Still, I felt uneasy. I told myself it was probably just an animal moving through at night. That was normal out here. I tried to shake it off. The day passed without trouble, but when night came again, I found myself more alert. I checked the locks on the doors twice, even though I knew they were old and wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. I pulled the curtains tight, lit the stove, and sat at the table reading. Every time the wood popped in the stove, I felt my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time it was closer, right outside the wall where the bedroom was. The same slow crunching steps. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, stopping now and then. I held the flashlight tightly, my palms sweating. After several minutes, I heard nothing. But then came another sound, lighter, sharper. A scrape, like fingernails or metal dragging lightly against wood. Slid along the wall, stopped, then slid again. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The scrape circled half the cabin, then stopped. Silence pressed in. I sat there in the dark until the stove burned down to embers. The next morning, I was on edge. My stomach felt tight, and every small sound made me flinch. I went outside again, circling the cabin in daylight. Near the back wall, I found something that made my throat go dry. On the wooden boards, about knee-height, there were faint scratches. Not claw marks, but long, thin lines, uneven and jagged, as if someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal along the wall. I stared at them for a long time. My mind tried to find excuses. Maybe it was old, something from before I came. Maybe some animal had done it, though I couldn't picture what kind. The scratches looked too straight, too deliberate. I forced myself to walk back inside, but the image stayed in my head all day. That night, I decided to stay awake and listen. I sat on the couch with the flashlight ready, a heavy piece of wood beside me. The stove gave off a dim orange glow. Midnight passed. I tried to stay alert, but the hours dragged. Just when my eyelids grew heavy, I heard it, the same slow steps. They came from the trees this time, approaching the cabin. My heart thudded. The steps circled again, steady, unhurried. Then came the scraping sound, right against the wall near where I sat. The hair on my arms stood up. I gripped the wood so tightly my hands hurt. For several minutes, it went on, scrape by scrape. I thought about turning on the flashlight, but I couldn't move. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence again. I waited. Nothing. Slowly, painfully, I climbed off the couch and crept to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I lay on the bed, heart racing, until the sky outside turned pale. By the fourth day, I couldn't shake the fear. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was hours away, and the road was rough. I told myself I would stay, that maybe it would pass. But deep down, I knew someone was out there. Not an animal. Person. That day, I walked farther into the woods than before, trying to distract myself. The trees stood silent and tall, their bare branches rattling in the wind. After about an hour, I noticed something strange. A thin trail I hadn't seen before. It wound through the trees, faint but clear enough. I followed it for a while, curiosity pulling me forward. After several minutes, I came to a small clearing. At the edge of it, hidden partly by brush, was something that made my stomach drop. An old tent, collapsed and torn, with a fire pit beside it filled with ash. Around it were bits of trash, rusted cans, broken bottles, scraps of cloth. It looked abandoned, but not for long. Some of the trash looked recent. I stood there, uneasy, my eyes scanning the ground. I noticed footprints in the dirt, faint but fresh. They led away from the clearing back into the woods. I didn't follow them. Instead, I turned and walked quickly back to the cabin, my pulse hammering in my ears. That night was the worst yet. I had barely lit the stove when the steps began. This time, they didn't circle. They came straight to the front door. I sat frozen as the sound of weight pressed against the old wood. Then came the scraping again, this time across the door itself. Slow, deliberate drags. My throat went dry. I didn't move all night. I sat in the corner, gripping the wood, until the first light of morning slipped through the cracks in the curtains. I knew then I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching, waiting, maybe testing me. I gathered my things quickly, stuffing everything into my bag. My hands shook so badly I dropped a jar that shattered on the floor. I didn't even clean it up. I loaded the car and started down the rough road. The trees loomed heavy on both sides, and every shadow looked like movement. I drove faster than I should have, tires slipping on gravel, my eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors. About halfway down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the path, nailed to a tree, was a piece of wood. It was splintered and rough, but across it were the same kind of scratches I had seen on the cabin. Long, uneven lines dragged deep into the surface. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas harder, heart pounding, until I reached the paved road. Only then did I slow down, though my hands kept trembling on the wheel. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to steady myself. The silence I had wanted so badly felt like it had followed me, heavy and suffocating. I had been wanting some time alone away from noise, traffic, and people. Work had been pulling me apart and my head felt heavy all the time. A friend of mine had once mentioned a small cabin deep in the woods of the northern mountains that could be rented for cheap. It was far away from towns, built near a lake, and surrounded by nothing but forest for miles. The place was perfect for what I wanted, which was silence and space to think. I made all the arrangements, bought enough food, fuel, and supplies for a week, and drove up there in my old pickup. The road to the cabin narrowed as I went higher into the woods. The last stretch was a dirt track with uneven stones that forced me to drive slow. I could see the cabin finally after almost 4 hours on the road. It was small, made of dark wood, with a tin roof that looked older than the rest of the structure. There was a small porch with 2 steps and a wooden door that looked solid but worn out. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened. On the side, through the trees, I could see the faint reflection of water from the lake. The cabin had no electricity. There was a small wood stove for heat, a lantern, and some shelves with old canned food left behind by other people who had stayed there. The first thing I did was check everything. I walked through the 2 rooms. One was a small bedroom with a single bed frame and mattress that had been used many times but still looked fine if covered with my own sheets. The other room was a combined space of kitchen and sitting area with the wood stove, shelves, and a small table. The floorboards creaked under my steps, but the place seemed solid. I unpacked my supplies, checked my water containers, and placed everything where I wanted. After that, I went outside to get a feel of the land. The lake was about 50 yards from the cabin, with clear water and tall pines all around. The ground was covered in thick leaves and pine needles, and there were no sounds except wind and the occasional crow. Felt calm at first. I thought I would enjoy the week here, reading, writing, and sitting in silence. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat near it, reading a book I had brought. The quiet was so deep that every small crack from the fire sounded sharp. I went to bed early, listening to the wind against the walls. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was simple. I fished a little in the lake, walked around the area, and sat on the porch for hours just staring at the trees. At some point, I noticed tracks on the ground not far from the cabin. They were faint, pressed into the damp soil, but they didn't look like deer or anything I usually saw. They were boot tracks. Someone had been walking close to the cabin. I told myself it was probably from whoever stayed here last, though the dirt looked fresh. That night, I went to bed early again, but I woke up sometime past midnight to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, but when I held my breath and listened, I was certain it was footsteps. Slow, careful steps on dry leaves. They moved from the side of the cabin toward the back, then stopped. I lay in bed completely still. My heart was hitting my chest hard. I waited for more sounds, but after a while, nothing came. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground. On the back side of the cabin, near the wall of the bedroom, I found clear boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I had not walked there. The tracks were deep and crisp, meaning they had been made not long ago. I followed them a short distance into the woods, but they disappeared among leaves and roots. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through. The forest was wide and people came here sometimes. Still, it felt wrong. The steps had stopped at my cabin in the middle of the night. Why would someone circle the place and leave quietly without knocking or calling out? The rest of the day, I felt on edge. I tried to fish again, but I kept looking at the tree line. Every few minutes, I thought I saw something move between the trunks. At times, I was sure someone was watching. By evening, I had a headache from staring into the woods. That night, I locked the door and kept the lantern burning low. I stayed awake longer, sitting on the bed, listening. The wind picked up, making branches knock together. Then, sometime after midnight again, I heard crunching outside. This time, I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. They circled the cabin. At one point, I heard the faint sound of breathing through the thin wall. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood and held it tight, waiting. After a long time, the sound moved away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the dark, gripping the hatchet, watching the door. By the next morning, I was torn. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I had driven hours out here, and I still wanted the time I had planned. I convinced myself it might have been a lost hiker. Still, I decided to be more careful. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs. Behind the trees on the far side, I found something that made my stomach twist. A cigarette, but pressed into the dirt, still fresh. I hadn't smoked in years, and there was no reason for it to be there. The thought of someone standing there, smoking, watching my cabin in the night made me feel sick. I kept telling myself I should leave, but some stubborn part of me didn't want to run off like I was scared. I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, cleaning, writing notes in my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I barely slept at all. Every creak and gust of wind made me tense. At some point, close to dawn, I thought I heard something scrape against the door, just a faint dragging sound, as if someone's hand had brushed across the wood. The fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay longer. I began packing early. While I was carrying supplies to the truck, I found more tracks leading from the trees to the cabin. They weren't even trying to hide it. Whoever it was had been coming back every night. I loaded everything fast, checking over my shoulder again and again. Just as I was closing the tailgate, I noticed something near the porch steps. A piece of folded paper, weighed down with a stone. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Inside, in messy handwriting, were the words, "I've been watching you." I froze, holding the paper, my chest tightening. My first thought was to get in the truck and drive as fast as I could. But before I even reached the door, I heard movement in the woods. It wasn't far. Leaves crunching, steady, coming closer. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine coughed, then started. My hands were shaking as I threw it into gear. In the side mirror, I saw a figure step out from behind the trees. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he just stood there, facing the cabin. I didn't wait to see more. I drove down the dirt track as fast as I could without losing control. The whole drive back, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see headlights following me, but nothing came. After nearly an hour of rough roads, I reached the main highway. Only then did I start to breathe normal again. When I finally got home, I felt drained, like I had been holding tension in every muscle for days. I thought about going to the police, but what could I even say? That someone had left tracks and a note and walked around a cabin at night? There was no crime to report, nothing concrete. Still, I knew I would never go back there again. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake at night, sure I can hear footsteps outside my window. I know it's just my mind replaying those nights, but I also know that someone was really there in those woods, watching me, coming closer each night. And if I hadn't left when I did, maybe they would have come inside. I had been driving for hours before I finally reached the narrow gravel road that led to the cabin. The road looked old and not well kept, with weeds pushing through cracks and deep ruts carved into the dirt where rainwater must have flowed for years. My small car rattled every time one of the tires dropped into a pothole. Dust rose up behind me, drifting over the empty forest road until the trees swallowed it. I was far from the nearest town. My phone had lost signal almost an hour back. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. I had never been here before, but I wanted a few days away from everything. The cabin sat in a valley surrounded by thick pine woods, with no houses for miles. From what I was told, the place was used for hunting in the fall, but most of the year it stayed empty. I had the keys, some food in the back seat, and a cooler of water. I planned to stay 4 nights. The road wound down a long slope, and I finally saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. The structure looked smaller than I expected, with a dark green roof and weathered wooden walls. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, with 2 steps leading up to it. A metal chimney stuck out the roof, rusted in spots but still standing straight. The yard around the cabin was mostly dirt and patches of tall grass, with the forest pressing in close from all sides. When I parked, the only sounds I could hear were insects buzzing and the faint creaking of trees moving in the breeze. The air felt still, heavy, and almost too quiet. I grabbed my bags and walked up the steps. The front door opened with a stiff push. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and something stale, like it had been shut up for months. The first room held a small table, 2 chairs, and a counter with a few old cabinets. A wood stove sat in the corner with a small pile of chopped logs beside it. The floor was uneven in places, the boards creaking when I walked. There was a narrow hallway that led to 1 bedroom, a bathroom, and a storage closet. The windows were old glass, cloudy in some spots, and they let in thin strips of light. I put my things in the bedroom. The bed frame was rough wood with a thin mattress, and the blanket folded on top looked like it hadn't been washed in years. I laid out my own sleeping bag instead. The air inside felt hotter than outside, so I opened 2 windows to let the breeze through. It helped a little, but the cabin still carried that stale smell. The first evening was calm. I made a small meal on a portable stove I had brought, since I didn't trust the old one in the cabin. I ate on the porch, watching the trees shift in the fading light. The sky turned orange behind the ridge, and the shadows from the woods grew darker and darker until the whole valley felt swallowed by black. By the time night fell, the only light came from my lantern and the pale glow of the moon over the treetops. It was only then that I realized how quiet it was. Back home, there were always distant cars, voices, or planes passing overhead. Out here, it felt like nothing existed beyond the trees. I could hear crickets and sometimes an owl, but even those seemed far away. The silence pressed in, making every small noise from the woods sound sharper. A snapping twig somewhere in the dark made me sit up straighter, even though I knew it was just an animal moving. When I finally went inside, I locked the door and checked the windows. Lying in the bed, I kept listening. The old wood of the cabin popped and creaked as it cooled. I told myself it was normal, but every time I heard a faint crunch of leaves outside, I tensed. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, sunlight came through the windows and the fear from the night before felt almost silly. I made coffee on the little stove and walked around the cabin yard. There was an old shed a few steps from the cabin, but its door was broken, and the inside was dark and full of tools and junk stacked high. I noticed tracks in the dirt near the shed. They looked like deer, maybe raccoon. Some were fresh. I told myself that explained the noises I heard at night. I spent most of the day reading and walking the small trails near the cabin. The forest was thick but beautiful, with tall trees rising straight into the sky. In some places, sunlight cut through in bright beams, while other areas stayed shadowed and damp. I found an old fire pit made of rocks a short walk from the cabin, with blackened wood inside it. Whoever used the cabin last must have sat here. That second evening, the air felt different. A storm was moving in, heavy clouds building over the ridge. I ate inside this time. The wind picked up after dark, pushing through the trees so it sounded like rushing water. The cabin creaked harder than before. Branches scraped the roof and made sharp noises against the windows. Around midnight, I woke to a loud sound outside. It was not the wind. It was heavy, slow, and sharp, like something had stepped on the wooden porch. I lay still, staring at the dark ceiling. Then another sound came, lighter but still solid, as if weight shifted on one of the boards outside the door. My chest tightened. I listened so hard my ears hurt. The wind roared, but I could still hear the faint groan of wood under pressure. Something or someone was standing on the porch. I thought of deer again, but deer don't climb steps or press weight into boards like that. I wanted to get up and check the door, but I stayed frozen. The sound stopped after a while. I lay awake the rest of the night, waiting for more. In the morning, I went outside. The porch boards had dirt on them, more than before, and a faint mark that looked like the edge of a boot sole. My stomach dropped. Maybe I was seeing things, maybe it was just a pattern in the wood, but it didn't look like any animal print. That whole day, I couldn't relax. Every sound in the woods made me turn. I walked farther down the road, just to see if there were other cabins or signs of people, but there was nothing, just more forest and hills. I told myself no one would be out here, no reason for it. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that mark on the porch. That night, I kept my lantern burning longer. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear. The forest felt even quieter than before. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Sometime deep in the night, I heard it again. The porch groaned. Slow, careful, not random like an animal. This time I sat up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the door. The lock was an old latch, not very strong. I held my breath and waited. Then the soft scrape of metal against wood came. The sound of someone touching the door handle. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and clicked it on, aiming it at the door. The noise stopped instantly. Silence filled the cabin. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I heard the crunch of dirt outside, moving slowly away from the porch. I stayed awake until dawn, my whole body tight with fear. When the light finally came, I checked the porch again. This time, there were clearer prints, definite shoe prints, pressed into the dirt near the steps. My throat felt dry. Someone had been here and not by accident. I thought about leaving right then, but the idea of driving that rough road in the dark with no phone signal made me hesitate. I told myself maybe it was some hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Maybe they didn't mean harm, but the way they touched the door in the night, it didn't feel right. That day, I tried to distract myself. I chopped some wood, walked around the trails again, forced myself to stay busy. But by evening, dread started building. I knew night was coming, and with it, whoever had been outside. I stacked some furniture against the door. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it would slow them. I closed every window tight, even though it made the cabin stuffy. My flashlight and knife stayed beside me. Hours passed. Crickets sang outside. Then silence fell again. That same heavy silence that pressed into my chest. The first sound came late. Faint footsteps on the dirt, circling the cabin. Slow, measured, deliberate. My skin crawled. They moved around to the side, then the back. I heard them brush against the wall, maybe testing the windows. When they returned to the porch, I was gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The boards groaned again. The door handle shifted. This time, the latch rattled harder, like they were pushing it. The furniture I had stacked shook against the door. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed silent, heart slamming in my chest. After a long moment, the rattling stopped. Then came the slow crunch of footsteps retreating again. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I made my decision. I packed my bag and loaded the car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the plan to stay longer. Whoever was coming at night wasn't stopping, and the cabin wasn't safe. As I backed down the gravel road, I checked the mirrors again and again. The forest swallowed the cabin behind me. I drove for nearly an hour before my phone signal returned. Only then did my body start to relax, though the fear still clung tight. By the time I reached town, I was exhausted. I returned the cabin key to my friend later, but I never told them exactly what happened. I just said I couldn't stay. I had been looking forward to some time away from everything for months, and when I finally got a chance to take a few weeks off from work, I decided to go somewhere quiet. I wanted no noise, no crowds, no constant reminders of the city. A friend of mine told me about an old cabin he knew of that could be rented for cheap. It was out in the woods, miles away from the nearest small town, and it had no neighbors anywhere near it. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I made the call, set up the rental, packed my truck, and drove out there with a plan to just relax, fish in the lake nearby, and catch up on some writing I had been putting off for years. The drive itself was long and mostly uneventful. Once I left the main highway, the road quickly narrowed into rough, winding gravel that cut through endless stretches of trees. My GPS signal dropped in and out, so I had to rely on printed directions. The deeper I went, the less I saw of other people. No gas stations, no houses, just woods on both sides, thick and quiet. The road twisted through small hills, and every now and then I would pass an unmarked dirt path that seemed to lead nowhere. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the cabin. It sat back from the road, at the end of a short dirt driveway. The trees opened up slightly in that area, but it was still surrounded by forest. The cabin itself looked like it had been standing for decades. The logs were dark, the roof had moss growing on parts of it, and the porch boards were weathered and warped. There was a stone chimney on one side and a shed out back. No other buildings, no signs of life. Just that one cabin sitting quietly in the woods. I parked, unloaded my things, and let myself in. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The floors creaked, the windows had heavy shutters, and the furniture was basic. A small kitchen with an old stove, a single bedroom with a thin mattress, and a living room with a fireplace and a sagging couch. It was simple, but I had expected that. I put my food in the cabinets, stacked my bags in the corner, and checked over the place. Everything seemed in order. There were extra blankets, a couple of old lanterns, and some canned food left behind by whoever had been there last. For the first day or two, it felt peaceful. I got up early, made coffee on the stove, and walked down to the lake with my fishing rod. The water was still and clear, and I could hear birds all around me. The only sounds were natural ones. Wind moving through the trees, water lapping against the shore, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. At night, it was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No cars in the distance, no city hum. Just silence broken by crickets and the occasional owl. But after the first few nights, I started noticing little things that felt off. The first time it happened, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound outside. It was faint, but sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or calls of night birds. It sounded like a footstep on gravel, slow and heavy. I sat up in bed, listening hard. First, nothing. Then another step. Then silence. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for it to come again. But it didn't. I eventually told myself it had to have been a deer or maybe even my imagination. I was in an unfamiliar place after all. The silence of the woods could make small things sound bigger than they were. Still, it took me hours to fall back asleep. The next morning, I looked around outside. The ground around the cabin was a mix of dirt and patches of grass. Not the easiest place to spot footprints. I didn't see anything obvious. I tried to put it out of my mind, but something about the sound had bothered me more than I wanted to admit. A few nights later, it happened again. Same time, around 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of steps. This time it was clearer. Someone or something was moving around outside the cabin. Not running, not stumbling. Walking. I could hear the crunch of dirt, then a pause, then another slow crunch. It circled from one side of the cabin to the other, stopping every few steps. I sat in bed, frozen, heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the sound was too steady, too human. I thought about getting up and looking out the window, but fear kept me still. I couldn't shake the thought that if I looked out, someone might be standing there looking back. The steps eventually faded away into silence again, but by then my nerves were shot. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I forced myself to check outside again. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the dirt. Near the edge of the tree line, I saw it. A single clear footprint, a boot tread pressed into the soil. It wasn't mine. The sight of it made my stomach drop. Whoever had been out there wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Someone really had been walking around the cabin in the middle of the night. From that moment on, the whole trip changed. The peaceful feeling I had in the beginning was gone. Every sound put me on edge. During the day, I kept scanning the woods, half expecting to see someone standing between the trees. At night, I barely slept at all. I kept the lantern on, clutching a kitchen knife I had pulled from the drawer. The footsteps returned every night, always around the same time. Sometimes they were just on one side of the cabin. Other times they went all the way around. One night, they stopped right outside the bedroom wall. I lay there, holding my breath, as whoever it was stood just feet away from where I slept. No knock on the door, no attempt to get inside, just standing, waiting. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again and slowly faded into the woods. I thought about leaving, but the problem was that the road out was rough and isolated. If someone was out there watching me, It meant they knew the area better than I did. Driving off in the middle of the night might put me in more danger. I decided to wait until morning, pack up, and leave during the day. But the next morning, when I went to my truck, I saw that something had changed. The driver's side door was slightly open. I knew for certain I had locked it. My chest tightened as I looked inside. Nothing obvious was missing, but my glove box had been opened and the papers inside were scattered. Whoever it was, they had been inside my truck. That was the moment I knew I had to get out. I couldn't spend another night there. I ran back inside, threw my things into my bags, and packed up as fast as I could. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. My hands shook as I loaded everything into the truck. When I finally got inside and started the engine, relief washed over me. I pulled out of the driveway and headed down the dirt road as fast as I dared without losing control. But after a few minutes, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The gas gauge. It was nearly empty. I had filled up before coming out to the cabin, and I hadn't done enough driving around to burn that much fuel. Someone had drained my tank while I slept. Panic set in. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't know if I would even make it. I kept driving, heart pounding, eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The woods pressed in on both sides, and every turn looked the same. I kept waiting for the engine to sputter and die. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of a small building ahead, a gas station. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there gripping the wheel, shaking. I had made it out. When I went inside to pay for gas, I asked the man working there if he knew anything about the cabin I had rented. His face tightened, and he shook his head quickly. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes told me enough. I filled up, got back in the truck, and drove straight home. Even now, months later, I can still hear those footsteps in my head when I try to sleep. Slow, steady, circling the cabin in the dead of night. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing for certain. Someone was out there watching me, waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out of that cabin alive. I drove out to the cabin on a late afternoon when the sky was dull and gray. The road was narrow, cracked in places, and lined with trees that seemed to lean over as if they wanted to swallow the path. The air felt heavy and smelled like damp soil, like it had rained the day before and the ground hadn't yet dried. I had rented the cabin for a week, thinking I needed a break from the city and from the noise that never seemed to stop. I told myself the quiet of the woods would help me reset, that being alone would feel refreshing. At the time, the thought of it didn't scare me. It felt like the right thing to do. The cabin was small and sat back from the dirt road, half hidden behind tall pines. The wood on the outside was dark, weathered from years of storms and snow, but the structure looked solid enough. The roof was steep, covered in dark shingles, and there was a stone chimney that looked like it had been built by hand. A small porch ran along the front with 2 steps leading up. I parked the car close, carried my bag inside, and locked the door behind me. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The air was cooler than outside, almost damp, like the place hadn't been aired out in a long time. The floorboards creaked under my shoes. There was a single main room with a wood stove against one wall, a small kitchen with just the basics, and a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom and a bedroom at the back. The windows were small and the curtains were thin, so even with the daylight, the place felt dim. I unpacked slowly, putting my clothes into the dresser in the bedroom and setting up the food I brought in the kitchen. I told myself it was good to settle in right away, that I wouldn't have to dig through bags later. I tried to make the place feel more normal, but no matter what I did, the silence pressed down on me. In the city, there was always some sound, cars, voices, music, something. Here, there was nothing. Even the wind barely moved through the trees. That first night, I cooked something simple and sat at the small table to eat. I noticed how the walls seemed to absorb sound. Even the scrape of my fork against the plate felt too loud, like it didn't belong. After eating, I went to the porch and sat for a while. The woods stretched in every direction, the trees thick and dark. As the sun went down, the woods turned black fast, like someone flipped a switch. There was no slow fade, no city lights to soften it, just sudden darkness. When I finally went inside, I locked the door, checked the windows, and turned on the one lamp in the living room. I tried to read but couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside. A branch snapping, something brushing against the wall. Each time I froze and listened, but it would go quiet again. I told myself it was the woods settling, animals moving around. I wanted to believe that, so I held on to it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The mattress was firm and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew. I lay there in the dark, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly the night sounds came. Crickets far away, the occasional crack of wood. I rolled over again and again, unable to sink into sleep. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps outside, slow and steady, moving across the porch. My body went stiff. I held my breath, listening harder. The steps stopped, then nothing. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Eventually, I told myself I had imagined it and forced my eyes shut. The next morning, I was tired, my head heavy. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and looked at the porch. I saw nothing unusual, no marks, no sign that anyone had been there. The dirt around the steps looked undisturbed. Still, the unease lingered. I pushed it away, deciding to go for a walk down the road to clear my head. The woods smelled fresh in the morning, and the damp air cooled my face. After a while, I started to feel more normal. The day went by quietly. I read, cooked, sat on the porch. But by late afternoon, the sky darkened again and the same heavy feeling returned. I caught myself checking the lock on the door more than once. I noticed how the woods seemed too still, as if they were holding something back. When night came, the fear came with it. This time, I made sure the curtains were shut tight and the stove was burning to keep some warmth in the room. I sat near the light, trying to pretend everything was fine. Then I heard it again. A noise outside, faint but clear. It wasn't random like a falling branch. It was steady, the sound of someone moving through the leaves. I froze. My heart began to race. I stared at the door, then at the windows, trying to see if anything moved outside. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. It circled around the cabin, slow, careful, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I turned off the lamp so the inside went dark, leaving only the faint orange glow of the stove. My eyes adjusted slowly. I stood in the corner, trying not to breathe too loud. The footsteps reached the porch. The boards gave a faint groan. Then silence. I waited. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. Nothing else happened. No knock, no voice, no door trying to open. After a while, I convinced myself to move back to the bedroom. I locked that door too, even though it was thin and wouldn't stop anyone determined. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for hours. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by every sound. In the morning, I checked again. The porch had faint marks, like dirt smeared across the boards. At the edge of the steps, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A shoe print. It was clear in the damp soil, too big to be mine. I felt a deep unease settle in me. I thought about leaving, about driving back to the city. But I told myself maybe it was a hiker passing through, maybe some hunter. I tried to reason it out to keep control. I forced myself to stay. The third night was worse. I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with the stove burning low. Around midnight, it started again. The sound of someone moving outside. This time, slower, closer. I could hear breathing through the wall, faint but steady. My skin crawled. Then the handle on the door moved, just a small rattle. Someone was testing it. I gripped the heavy iron poker from the stove and waited. My hands shook, but I held on. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Then it stopped. I stood in silence for what felt like forever. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there, and they knew I was here. They weren't passing through. They were watching, waiting. I checked my phone but had no signal. The road was miles long before it reached a highway. I thought about packing the car, but the idea of walking outside, of turning my back on the trees, made my chest tighten. Still, I couldn't stay forever. The fourth night broke me. I sat by the stove, exhausted, when I heard the window at the back creak. Not the door this time, the window. I ran to the bedroom and saw the curtain move slightly as if touched from outside. Then a face. For a split second, pale skin and dark eyes peered through before vanishing. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my throat dry. I gripped the poker, shaking all over. I didn't move for hours, waiting, listening, sure they would try again. But nothing else happened. When the morning light came, I made my choice. I gathered everything fast, stuffed it into my bag, and carried it to the car. My eyes scanned the woods the whole time, expecting to see someone standing there. I drove out fast, the tires sliding on the dirt, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop driving. I didn't look back. Only later, when I was far from the woods, did I pull over and let myself breathe. My body shook, and my chest ached as if I'd been holding my breath for days. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone the full story. But the image of that face in the window never left me. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were there. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left alive.